You're walking along the shores of medieval Japan. The air is salt-heavy. You hear the calls of distant gulls and the rhythmic hush of waves slapping sand. But beneath your feet lies a history most never think about, hidden in the shimmer of broken seashells and the faint scent of brine. Long before seashells became symbols of simplicity or beachside vacations, they were taxable assets in Japan. Not exotic ones either. We're not talking about rare mollusks or pearl-studded treasures. No, these were ordinary clams, conchs, and spiral shells, the kind you might toss aside today. Yet in the Kamakura and Muromachi periods, 1185–1573, these shells were systematically gathered, documented, assessed, and taxed. Why? Because in the finely tuned, often weary machine of medieval Japanese governance, nothing was too small to escape notice, not even a seashell. Let's begin at the shoreline literally. Harvesters of the shore. In medieval Japan, coastal communities were heavily reliant on the bounty of the sea. Not just fish or seaweed, but also shellfish like asari, Japanese little-neck clams, hamaguri, hard clams, and akagai arc shells. These were staples of both diet and commerce. They provided protein in regions where farmland was limited, and they were also crucial to regional trade. But seashells had another role: currency. Or more accurately, they were proto-currency and tribute objects. In some regions, particularly in the Ryukyu Islands and Kyushu's southern coastal villages, specific shells were accepted in kind by regional lords daimyo and tax collectors in place of coin or rice. Why? The answer, as always in historical taxation, lies in logistics. Coinage was limited, rice was perishable, but shells, particularly cleaned and dried shells, could be stored, transported, and standardized. Some were used in rituals. Others were valued for their color or toughness. Some were used in lacquerware, inlay, and cosmetics. And some were simply counted because that's what the law demanded. Shellwork and shogunate policy. In the Kamakura period, the shogunate sought to extend its influence over rural taxation by expanding what could be recorded and demanded. A document known as the Kaiseki Daicho, or Marine Harvest Register, from 1327 details local shell levies across Sagami and Boso provinces. Each hamlet was expected to provide a specific quantity of cleaned shells quarterly. These shells were sometimes turned over directly to the regional stewards, jiid, or to Buddhist temples who managed local tax collection. Temples, yes. This part of Japanese history might surprise you. Buddhist temples often played the role of administrative intermediaries. Monks managed local account books, enforced quotas, and mediated disputes. In coastal towns like Kamigawa, monks would physically inspect baskets of shell offerings, comparing them to ledger stones, etched tablets stored at the temple outlining tax minimums. And the penalties? Simple. Fail to deliver your shells and you owed rice. Miss that deadline and your fishing tools might be confiscated. Persistently fail and you'd face relocation or labor draft for public works projects. Classification of shells, a boring art form. To the modern mind, it might seem odd to picture a tax officer hunching over baskets of shells, counting, categorizing, and weighing them. But that's precisely what happened. Shells were classified by size, sheen, color, and species. Some were measured using bamboo calipers and sorted into categories with names like kakaku, hard shell, shiragai, white shell, and yuzushio, spiral shell. Certain species were exempt if they were used in ritual purposes. Others, particularly black or cracked specimens, were deemed futeni, unfit, and discarded or counted at a penalty ratio. 2 bad shells equaled 1 good. There's a recorded dispute from 1361 in Hitachi province in which a collector rejected a whole shipment of clam shells due to soft ridge markings. This escalated into a legal complaint filed in Kyoto, which took over 2 years to settle. Shells and status. As with everything in medieval Japan, class mattered. Fisher folk at the bottom of the hierarchy paid their shell taxes directly, but merchants in larger towns like Kamakura or Nara were often exempt. Instead, they paid in coin or rice. This created tension, especially during years of poor harvest. Villagers might owe shells they could not gather either because of red tide, monsoon, or sea bans enforced due to piracy. And yes, piracy. In the 14th century, inland piracy wasn't just about raiding ships. Some groups blocked access to productive shell-gathering shores and demanded bribes for safe passage. Some lords turned this into a legal function. They licensed access. A recorded instance from 1413 refers to a shelling toll post, Kaino Seki, near the entrance to Lake Hamana. Gatherers had to display a wooden placard carved with a tax license to legally collect there. The Temple of Shell Weights. One of the most curious archaeological sites discovered in Chiba Prefecture is what researchers believe was a shell-weighing station operated by the Nichiren Buddhist sect. Excavated in the 1980s, the site featured scale stones, clay weights marked with symbols for shell types, and a partially intact ledger with recorded quotas from nearby fishing villages. Here, shells were not just taxed but symbolically blessed before shipment. This merging of spiritual and fiscal authority blurred the lines between sacred obligation and statecraft. The monks were not merely passive receivers, they were accountants, bureaucrats, and, occasionally, enforcers. Why seashells? You might be wondering why not just tax the fish, or the boats, or labor hours. In truth, those were taxed too. But the shell tax had a unique advantage. It was tangible, countable, divisible, and seasonal. It provided a steady stream of material that could be repurposed, sold, or gifted. During certain ceremonies, lords gifted rare shell types as signs of favor. There's a 1452 account of the shogun Ashikaga Yashimasa presenting lacquered shells filled with incense to a Korean envoy. But more than anything, taxing shells allowed control. It gave the government and its religious proxies an excuse to monitor the coast, regulate movement, and reinforce social hierarchy through mundane obligations. A tide of questions. So the humble seashell, whether found nestled in beach sand or hauled up in fishing baskets, was not just nature's detritus. It was policy. It was punishment. It was peace offering and ledger entry. It was a symbol of a state trying desperately to control the edges of its realm, not through armies or coins, but through quotas and quiet inspections. But how did the villagers respond to this persistent oversight? What quiet forms of resistance or adaptation emerged from this sandy, bureaucratic ballet? You've seen how a shell could be taxed, weighed, and rejected. But what did this mean for those at the bottom, those doing the bending, gathering, and hauling? Shell taxation in medieval Japan was more than a footnote in administrative history. It shaped communities, economies, and belief systems. In this section, we follow the lives of the people, those who lived beneath the surface of tax records and temple registers. They didn't write the rules, but they responded to them in ways both subtle and stubborn. Shellers and shadows, life along the coast. In the fishing villages of Kyushu and the Boso Peninsula, shell gathering wasn't seasonal. It was constant. When other food ran short, the shoreline always offered something. Even when tides were wrong or weather foul, families scraped at the sand and mud with woven baskets and split bamboo scoops. But for many, their shell quota was not just a part of life, it was a constraint. A family might need to gather thousands of clams or spiral shells each month to meet quotas. These would be rinsed, dried, sorted, and brought to regional tax stations. In lean years, families often faced a bitter choice: eat the shellfish and risk missing their quotas, or deliver them and go hungry. The tax was never just about economics, it was about obedience. And this, in time, sparked a series of quiet rebellions. Rebellion without riot, the art of passive resistance. What does rebellion look like when your entire life depends on cooperation with a system you cannot escape? Sometimes it looks like wet shells. According to a 1449 complaint from the coastal office in Casusa province, entire shipments of shells were being delivered, uncured, not properly dried. This subtle act rendered them useless for sale or use in lacquer inlay. While impossible to prove as malicious, the frequency and consistency raised suspicions. Others reported shipments with only one size of shell, throwing off classification ratios. More clever still, villagers would deliver shells with signs of barnacle scarring, meaning they had been collected far out at sea, a dangerous and technically illegal practice. These were tiny acts, too small for courts, too frequent for coincidence, resistance in the form of paperwork clutter. The shell forgers. Among the most fascinating records from the Muromachi period are the so-called kainaisai, jiken, the fake shell incidents. These involved villagers crafting imitation shells from clay or soapstone, then baking them and coating them in crushed pigment to simulate sea wear. Some were surprisingly effective. A 1477 report from a tax station in Awa province mentions curiously warm shells that upon inspection crumbled under pressure. The station master, suspicious, immersed one in vinegar. It dissolved within minutes. Punishments were light, usually conscription for canal dredging or additional shell quotas. But these forgeries represented something more: the lengths to which people would go to avoid starvation while still appearing to comply. Religious loopholes and blessed baskets. By the 15th century, temples had not only become tax collectors but also spiritual intermediaries. And as with any religious institution involved in finance, loopholes began to form. One common practice was the kaikuyo, the shell memorial offering. Villagers would gather shells and dedicate them at local shrines, ostensibly for the souls of dead relatives or for safe childbirth. These were not taxed, and while authorities tried to regulate the volume of such offerings, they rarely succeeded. Temples argued these were spiritual acts, not economic ones. This led to creative redistribution. Families would offer 50 shells at a shrine, then reclaim them later, having earned exemption. In one case from 1483, a single set of spiral shells was passed between 3 villages under a shared ritual license, each claiming the shells had been blessed for local purification rites. Some monks cooperated, others turned a blind eye. Still others developed semi-official ritual taxation procedures, wherein shells were taxed slightly but marked with red ink as holy use approved. These marked shells were often resold for higher prices in urban markets. Shell priests and the economics of mercy. Certain monks became local legends for their protection of shellers. One such figure was the priest Jayakaku of the Kanenjai Temple in Awa province. Known for his intricate shell-shaped votive charms, Jayakaku offered spiritual protection scrolls to villagers. These scrolls granted bearer immunity from shell quotas for 30 days, assuming they completed a pilgrimage around the temple grounds. Jayakaku argued that the sea belongs first to the Buddha, then to the people, and only lastly to the taxman. Though condemned by regional tax offices, his influence was significant. One log from 1469 complains that over 300 shells were withheld due to interference by certain spiritual actors who distort the true order of the realm. That phrasing, true order, says a lot. It suggests taxation was not simply a matter of collection, but of symbolic obedience to a centralized structure. Rebellion, even mild, was interpreted as a disruption of harmony. Shell money and subversive currency. As shell collection became more institutionalized, it also became more regulated. But that didn't stop people from turning it into their own form of currency. In some markets, especially in rural Awa and northern Kyushu, certain shells began to function as tokens. One spiral shell might buy a small scoop of miso. 3. A rice ball. These informal economies challenged the state's attempt to monopolize shell value through taxation. This subversion didn't go unnoticed. In 1490, The provincial court in Chikuzen issued a directive forbidding the use of common shell types as market exchange objects, but it was nearly impossible to enforce. Villagers simply claimed the shells were ceremonial or decorative. By formalizing taxation, the state had accidentally encouraged people to rethink value altogether. Women shells and silent networks. In nearly all coastal shelling communities, women made up the majority of gatherers. Their roles, however, were minimized in the official records. Instead, their work appears indirectly in shrine offerings, marriage dowries of dried shells, or temple prayers for mothers of the shore. Women also played key roles in subverting quotas. They passed information, shared tools, and redistributed loads between households. Many engaged in what we might now call mutual aid rotating schedules to ensure families had enough to eat while still meeting tax expectations. In one surviving diary fragment from a village near Hitachi, a woman named Kinu recorded monthly shell counts, community share logs, and weather notations. It's one of the only first-hand documents that gives us insight into the rhythms of this world. North wind today, tide's not good, shared the morning catch with Hama's family. 3 baskets hidden behind the shrine tree. We will dig again after dusk. Here is quiet resilience. Bureaucracy met not with fire or force, but with adaptation, discretion, and solidarity. The bureaucrat's burden. It might be tempting to villainize the tax collectors in this story, but many were simply cogs in a system they could not change. Regional collectors, often of lower samurai or monkly rank, were given strict quotas and narrow budgets. They were punished for underreporting or lax enforcement. Records show complaints not just from villagers, but from the collectors themselves. One reads, "Shells delivered were black with rot. I have no means of verifying their quality. If I reject them, I am cursed. If I accept them, I am fined. I live between ocean and obligation." Even officials found themselves in the gray zones of enforcement. Some quietly allowed exemptions. Others overcollected, fearful of reprimand. A few became reformers, but most simply endured. A fragile balance. By the late 15th century, several provinces began phasing out direct shell quotas in favor of rice equivalents or coin assessments. Shells became increasingly symbolic ritual rather than required, but their decades of influence had already reshaped shoreline life. This was not a rebellion of pitchforks or flames. It was a rebellion of wet shells, forged imitations, blessed baskets, and quiet conversations in the dark. And it forces us to ask, how did such a peculiar system last as long as it did? And what finally caused the tide to turn? You've walked the beaches. You've watched the villagers carry their baskets, heard the monks chant over shell-laden altars, and followed the quiet rebellions of a people weary of tribute. But every system, no matter how bureaucratically robust, meets its tide. In this final section, we explore how and why the shell taxation system faded from medieval Japan. It was not one dramatic collapse, but a slow erosion of purpose, relevance, and practicality. And within that decline, we see how history doesn't just vanish, it recedes like the tide, leaving traces in unexpected places. Changing priorities, centralization, and currency. By the start of the Azuchi-Momoyama period, 1573–1600, the internal dynamics of Japanese governance had changed. The unification efforts of Oda Nobunaga, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and eventually Tokugawa Ieyasu created a new political environment, one that prized military allegiance and centralized taxation over the localized, ad hoc tribute systems of prior centuries. Under Hideyoshi's land surveys, Teiko Kenchai, rice became the core unit of taxation, standardized as koku, the amount of rice needed to feed one person for a year. Everything else, fish, textiles, timber, and yes, shells, was to be calculated in its rice equivalent or converted to monetary value. Shells, by contrast, were unruly. They varied by region, species, and season. They spoiled. They were not coin nor truly commodity, and most importantly, they couldn't fund a warlord's campaigns. As a result, beginning in the 1580s, formal shell taxation was phased out in favor of rice or coin equivalents in major provinces like Kaga, Sagami, and Chikyuzen. Smaller, more remote provinces followed over the next 2 decades. Shells would still be traded, they would still be gathered, but they would no longer be entered in ledgers as state dues. Decline in documentation. The disappearance of shell taxation is most clearly seen in what is not recorded. By the early 1600s, temple account books that once listed shell quotas begin referencing shells only as offerings or market goods. The Kaiseki Daicho, Marine Harvest Register, once painstakingly copied and revised, becomes silent. Tax inspectors stop listing shell categories, weights disappear, ledger stones at temples crumble from neglect. Yet the silence isn't sudden. There's no law statting, shell taxes are abolished. Instead, it's an administrative fadding like ink left out in the sun. This is a pattern seen often in history. Not every system ends with a bang. Some simply become unnecessary. What replaced shells? While rice and coins replaced the shell tax formally, coastal communities continued to use shells in trade and ceremony. Some fishing families still offered them to local temples, not out of obligation but tradition. In certain areas, like the Shima Peninsula, shells were repurposed as religious charms. A specific type of scallop shell known as sazi became associated with good fortune in childbirth and was worn on cords by midwives, a symbolic transformation from taxed object to sacred item. In inland markets, lacquered shells were sold as novelties or children's toys. Their value remained, just not as part of the state's system. Even in governance, remnants persisted. A 1621 inventory from a tax post in Bungo province lists disused shell weights stored in a chest labeled Archive Curiosities. Bureaucracy, too, holds on to its memories. Temples in transition. Buddhist temples, once powerful tax collectors, also saw change. As the Tokugawa shogunate rose, it imposed new religious policies. The Terryuki system, temple registration, shifted temple responsibilities toward family tracking and religious certification. Shell quotas were gone, and with them, the economic authority that allowed monks to act as intermediaries. Some temples adapted by preserving their role in ritual use of shells, blessings, festivals, and memorials. Others became archives of shell history, displaying ledgers, tax baskets, or prayer charms in small museum-like halls. These were the early seeds of historical preservation. In one preserved document at a Kyoto temple, a monk's annotation reads, "Once these shells were burdens, now they are offerings. May we never confuse the two again." Legacy in language. The bureaucratic obsession with shells may be gone, but its fingerprints remain in language and culture. In certain dialects, the word kaiwari, shell split, still refers to an unequal or unfair deal, echoing the disputes over broken or underweight shells. Likewise, kayasui, shellizi, became a slang term for something undervalued or dismissed. In poetry, shells were sometimes metaphors for futility or bureaucracy. One 17th century haiku reads, "Empty of meat, still weighed and recorded. Old shell at tax time." More than an object, the shell became a symbol of forgotten burdens of systems that once seemed permanent, now rendered absurd by hindsight. What the shell tax reveals. To modern eyes, taxing seashells may appear laughably inefficient, even petty, but that would miss the larger truth. The shell tax system reveals how far a government will go to exert control over its periphery. When coinage was rare and authority decentralized, collecting physical proof of productivity, however mundane, became essential. Shells provided a metric, a foothold, A way to say, "We see you," even from Kyoto's distant courtrooms. But it also reveals the tension between bureaucracy and daily life. The state demands clarity, categories, compliance. Life resists. People adapt, deceive, spiritualize, or simply endure. The seashell, in all its ordinariness, became a battleground for these forces. Archaeological echoes. Even today, remnants of this system emerge from the soil. In coastal digs across Chiba and Kanagawa, archaeologists have uncovered shell sorting pits, carved wooden markers, clay weights shaped like clams, and stone tablets etched with quotas. In some temples, ledger stones remain illegible but solemn. And in museums, lacquered shell tools and temple charms sit quietly in glass displays, often with vague labels like ritual object or economic token. Few visitors stop to read them. Fewer still ask what they meant or why they mattered. Yet these artifacts whisper. They tell of a time when the beach was not a place of rest, but of measurement and duty. A reflection at the shore. As you return to the present, leaving behind tied logs and temple ledgers, consider this. Not all history is shaped by battles or emperors. Some of it is shaped by shells, by the persistence of mothers hauling baskets, by the quiet revisions of monks, by tax inspectors recording the curvature of a clam in triplicate. Systems rise, they fall, but in the space between, people live, adapt, and remember. You might never look at a seashell the same way again. And perhaps that is the most honest form of history, the transformation of the ordinary into something quietly profound. You hold a warm cup in your hand. Steam curls upward, the faint scent of roasted leaves lingers in the air. It feels timeless, simple. But in Edo period Japan, 1603–1868, tea was not just a drink. It was a diplomatic tool, a taxable good, a political lever, and perhaps most curiously a source of bureaucratic headaches that stretched across the entire archipelago. Today you sip, but back then your tea might have passed through a dozen hands, crossed provinces, and been recorded in as many as 20 different ledgers, each with its own seal, signature, and stamp of approval. And for all its cultural elegance, tea diplomacy was not always poetic. It was slow, contentious, and by modern standards exhaustively dull. But that is where the richness lies. The shogun's tea table. Let's begin at the top. Tokugawa Ieyasu, the founder of the Tokugawa shogunate, was an admirer of chanoyu, the ritualized tea ceremony, and maintained that certain daimyo, feudal lords, must demonstrate cultural refinement through their knowledge of tea practice. This was not merely aesthetic, it was political. In an era where warfare was discouraged, the tea room became a space for symbolic combat. The exchange of rare leaves, finely crafted bowls, or exclusive water sources became proxies for power. Tea was used to demonstrate taste, restraint, and allegiance. In 1627, a daimyo from Tosa province was reprimanded not for rebellion, but for delivering poorly roasted tea as a diplomatic gift to Edo. The leaves were deemed excessively bitter, insufficiently curled, and the incident was documented in court records. This was not a culinary critique, it was a political slight. Tea as tax. While the shogun's tea was ceremonial, the tea of the common provinces was economic. In many parts of central Honshu, particularly Uji, Shizuoka, and Kowing, tea was cultivated on terraced hillsides. It was labor-intensive and seasonal, requiring hand-picking, sun-curing, and repeated rolling by skilled workers. By the late 1600s, as domestic demand grew and interdomain trade expanded, tea began to appear in tax inventories. But unlike rice, tea wasn't standardized. The weight and quality could fluctuate. So instead of taxing tea by amount, the government instituted a series of inspection checkpoints. These checkpoints, often manned by low-level samurai or retired monks, functioned like bureaucratic toll booths. A farmer in Uji might deliver 10 pounds of tea to a merchant house. The merchant would then register it at the Kusatsu tea office, receive a stamped tag, and pass through a chain of checkpoints, each issuing new documentation. By the time the tea arrived in Edo, it had acquired as many as 8 separate travel documents, all tied with cord to the outer basket. If any document was missing, the tea could be impounded, burned, or rejected. The paper trail of leaves. Let's pause here. Imagine a basket of tea not loose, not in elegant ceramic jars, but wrapped in coarse mulberry paper, sealed with ink stamps, lacquered cords, and wax insignia. Each package bore handwritten notes, place of origin, date of harvest, quality grade, owner's name, and purpose of transport. Common designations included: commercial exchange, tribute for lordly use, gift for temple ceremony, trial sample for merchant evaluation. Inspectors were expected to know the difference between a trade good and a diplomatic gift. The latter required special permissions. If labeled incorrectly, the goods could be confiscated as fraudulent tribute. That classification, while rarely enforced, was a stain on a merchant's reputation. One merchant house in Nagoya was blacklisted for 3 years after mistakenly marking a batch of low-grade summer tea as imperial eligible, a title reserved for only the top 3% of tea harvests. Temple involvement and ritual distribution. Much like with shell taxation in earlier centuries, temples became administrative intermediaries. Major Zen monasteries such as Manpukujai and Uji served as official processors and auditors of tea quality for government use. Monk's wood. Rose test batches. Rate flavor profiles. Certify leaf type and soil origin. Stamp certification tags. These certified teas were often redirected for diplomatic gifting, particularly to domains that the Tokugawa court wished to keep loyal, such as the Shimazu clan in Satsuma or the Date clan in Sendai. Gifting high-grade tea was a show of trust, but also a subtle assertion of central control. Temples also ran their own tea routes, dispatching ritual teas for annual ceremonies across the empire. These were not taxed, but they were tracked. An entire sub-branch of the Jishibujyo Temple Magistrate's Office maintained ledgers of spiritual leaf flow. The Uji monopoly scandal. In 1712, a scandal erupted when it was discovered that several tea inspectors had been over-certifying Uji tea for kickbacks. They labeled lower-quality regional tea as Uji grown to satisfy merchant demands. The shogunate responded by issuing the tea purity edicts, which required physical inspection by dual-party audits, samurai and monk, regional origin tags etched into bamboo slats, not paper, periodic surprise inspections by traveling officials. This increased paperwork dramatically. One delivery log from 1714 records that a single cart of tea carried 12 inspection tags, 3 letters of recommendation, and 1 notarized diagram of the hillside where the tea had grown. Boredom as control. Why so much paperwork? Why so much fuss over leaf and stem? Because boredom in Edo governance was a tool of control. By turning every economic activity into a paper trail, the Tokugawa regime discouraged rebellion. If a merchant had to pass through 6 offices to deliver 1 crate of tea, he had no time to organize uprisings or fund samurai factions. Bureaucracy smothered ambition. This was part of the bakufu's larger strategy: immobilize the daimyo, fix the social classes, and render the population too entangled in ledgers to rebel. Tea, with its elegance and perishable delicacy, was the perfect vector for this strategy. It required constant supervision, seasonal recalibration, and subjective judgment. The perfect excuse for endless oversight. Tea and the foreign lens. Foreigners, particularly the Dutch at Dejima, were baffled by Japan's tea logistics. A 1771 Dutch report from the VOC Dutch East India Company, describes. Tea arrives bound like a prisoner, bearing scrolls and stamps like a nobleman. Its value lies not only in its flavor but in its labyrinthine journey. The Dutch learned to navigate the tea system by hearing local intermediaries called chatsukai, tea guides, who specialized in handling permits, translations, and bribes. The smuggling problem. Despite all efforts, tea smuggling was rampant. Some merchants relabeled old leaves as new inserted foreign blends, including Chinese jasmine, or diluted high-grade teas with roasted twigs, kukacha, and resold them as refined blends. Smuggled tea often traveled via night boats, hidden beneath baskets of miso or dried squid. Punishments ranged from temporary banishment to permanent blacklisting, but prosecutions were rare. The paper trails, ironically, were too complex to trace fully. An open tag in a closed court. In 1802, a tea shipment intended for the Tokugawa court arrived with its outer certification tag partially unsealed. This minor breach triggered a 3-week investigation, 6 depositions, and the reassignment of 2 minor magistrates. The tea was deemed unfit for noble use, but was later donated to a local temple, where it was brewed during a drought ceremony. The monks reportedly declared it acceptable if dry. Steaming toward a question. So here we are, seated before steaming kettles and mountain-grown leaves. But now you see behind the curtain, the elegant pour, the soft clink of ceramics, the way the bowl is turned 3 times before sipping. Beneath that, miles of roads, stamped permits, sealed bags, burnt fingertips, tired scribes, and tea baskets tied tighter than any soldier's sword. And we're left with this. How did a drink of such grace become a chain of such regulation? And what happened when the rules could no longer keep up with the changing world? You've seen the slow elegance of bureaucracy, scrolls, stamps, seals, and tea leaves traveling across the country in a swirl of ink and policy. But every system, no matter how meticulous, eventually starts to leak. And in Edo, Japan, the tea trade began to strain under the weight of its own perfectionism. This section peels back the neatness. It shows the human side of this system, flawed, resistant, opportunistic. As the 18th century wore on, tea diplomacy turned increasingly into tea deception. And in that shift, we glimpse a society quietly outgrowing its own rules. The growth of tea consumption. By the mid-1700s, tea had become deeply embedded in Japanese daily life. What had once been a luxury of temples and lords now found its way into the hands of townspeople, farmers, and merchants. New processing techniques like sencha, which did not require the powdered grinding of matcha, made tea cheaper and easier to prepare. With rising demand came increasing pressure on supply chains, and thus on the bureaucracy trying to manage them. Inspectors now faced overwhelming volumes, especially from peak production zones like Uji, Kyoto Prefecture, Shizuoka, Sayama, Saitama Prefecture, Kagoshima, Southern Kyushu. More tea meant more paperwork, but budgets for inspections didn't grow. So corners were cut, seals were sold, and loopholes were exploited. The rise of the tea brokers. Enter the Chadanya tea brokers. These middlemen emerged to fill the gaps between producers and official buyers in major cities. They handled permit applications, bribes for expedited inspections, label substitution, fake certification tags. By 1775, several broker families in Osaka and Edo had built entire networks around manipulating the certification system. They bought low-quality tea in bulk, added dried orange peel or sakura blossom for scent, and passed it off as a temple-certified ceremonial blend. One notorious family, the Koyama House, was caught using falsified monastery stamps from Mampukujai Temple, hand-carved in wood and coated with soot ink to appear faded and aged. When raided, they were found with 300 blank certification scrolls, 78 carved stamps of various temples and officials, 1,400 pounds of low-grade summer tea, repackaged as Uji Spring Harvest. They were fined, disbanded, and their ledgers burned in public. But within months, similar operations sprang up again under different names. The demand was simply too high and the bureaucratic enforcement too slow. Temple corruption and quiet complicity. The temples, long considered pillars of moral and administrative oversight, were not immune. As the religious sector suffered under stagnant stipends and rising costs, some monasteries began quietly licensing their stamps to brokers and merchants in exchange for donations. These were not crude deals. They were wrapped in ritual language. A token for sustaining the garden's upkeep. A spiritual aid to monastic longevity. A gesture of appreciation for past blessings. The exchange was known but rarely punished. The Tokugawa state still depended on temples for civil records, religious order, and social stability. Cracking down too harshly risked disrupting that balance. Still, the shogunate issued warnings. In 1793, an edict reminded monasteries that the weight of the kettle must not outweigh the burden of truth. It was poetic, but largely ignored. Falsification of origin, ujiwari. Among the most common and difficult to detect offenses was ujiwari, the falsification of tea origin. Uji tea, prized for its flavor and texture, carried status. Merchants across the country falsely labeled their products as uji grown to fetch higher prices or satisfy tribute requirements. Techniques included transporting dried leaves from other regions and mixing them with small amounts of uji tea. Re-rolling and roasting leaves to mimic uji's color and shape. Packaging tea in repurposed, uji-stamped paper and baskets. Inspectors often couldn't tell the difference, especially if the leaves had been artificially treated. Some even colluded, accepting bribes to pass off mixtures as authentic. A frustrated official wrote in an 1807 internal memo, "All tea is now uji if one says it so. Perhaps we should begin taxing honesty instead." Hidden trade in foreign tea. Despite sakoku, the policy of national seclusion, small quantities of Chinese and Southeast Asian tea entered Japan via the Dutch at Dejima or smuggled through Ryukyu Island merchants. Foreign teas, especially jasmine, oolong, and pu'er, were illegal for sale, deemed disruptive to taste and culture. But that didn't stop elite families from acquiring them. Some were sold under euphemisms. Moon harvest for Chinese black tea. Southern wind leaves for Thai-sourced oolong. Lotus mist for Vietnamese green tea. Documents reveal that even some Edo officials ordered these teas for private ceremonies using coded letters and disguised runners. One inspector, caught with a jar of foreign tea in 1816, defended himself by saying, "It is not a foreign tea if one drinks it in a local mood." He was stripped of rank but not imprisoned. The joke had likely saved him. The paper collapse, too many seals. By the early 1800s, there were so many seals in circulation, legitimate, illegitimate, and semi-legitimate, that the entire system began to implode. To manage the overload, the shogunate attempted several reforms. The Leaf Ledger Edicts, 1819, required all tea shipments over 5 pounds to be logged in central databases in Edo. But without a central bureaucracy equipped to handle this scale, implementation failed. The Ink Standardization Act, 1823, mandated all official seals use a specific red pigment sourced from Akita. This led to shortages, forgeries of the pigment itself, and more confusion. The boil-to-test policy, 1827, proposed that suspicious teas be brewed on-site for taste testing, but many inspectors had never drunk fine tea themselves. Several misjudged genuine teas as fake and vice versa. The policy was quietly scrapped. Tensions among domains. Tea also became a source of inter-domain rivalry. The Satsuma domain, which had its own successful tea trade, accused Edo officials of favoring Uji-origin teas and artificially suppressing prices for regional blends. In 1832, this nearly led to a full economic boycott, only resolved by allowing Satsuma to export tea directly to Osaka markets without passing through Uji certification. These tensions mirrored broader political dissatisfaction in the late Edo period, as the rigid structures of Tokugawa control began to show their age. Tea riots and market unrest. While never violent on a large scale, several urban protests broke out in the 1840s over rising prices for mid-grade tea, falsified tea sold as temple ceremonial, seized tea shipments for unclear regulatory violations. In one 1848 incident in Nihonbashi, a crowd surrounded a merchant cart accused of selling grave tea leaves meant for funerary offerings at a festival market. The merchant claimed he had bought it from a certified vendor. The inspector refused to resolve the dispute. The cart was overturned, and the tea burned in the street. A quiet cultural shift. Even as the bureaucracy faltered, people adapted. Town tea houses became informal regulators. Customers trusted certain shops by name and tradition. The three-bowl rule emerged. If tea failed to satisfy within 3 sips, it was unworthy of sale. Cultural knowledge began to outpace bureaucratic enforcement. Taste replaced tag. This was the beginning of the end not of tea itself, but of the paper empire built around it. Steeped in questions. So what happens when a ritualized system meant to reflect refinement, trust, and control falls under the weight of its own minutiae? What does it mean when counterfeit seals outnumber authentic ones? When even monks offer stamps for a price? When everyone nods to the rules, but no one truly follows them? Does the tea lose its meaning, or does it become something else freed from paperwork, finally allowed to just be tea? We've traced the careful roots of tea across Edo period Japan past toll stations and temple gates, through paper labyrinths and seal-ink bureaucracies. We've seen how a leaf could carry prestige, how a stamp could carry power, and how both could eventually mean almost nothing at all. Now we arrive at the end, not a dramatic tea spilled upon scroll moment, but a slow unraveling, a quiet, inevitable dissolution of a system that had grown too intricate for the world it sought to contain. This final section explores how tea diplomacy, and tea as a symbol of bureaucratic Japan, was ultimately swept aside by forces no stamp or monk could control. Tea and the earthquakes of change. In the 1850s, Japan faced disruption on every front. Nature played its part. Earthquakes, poor harvests, and floods destabilized agricultural regions. Famines reduced demand for ceremonial teas. People needed calories, not culture. More devastating were the human quakes. Commodore Perry's arrival in 1853, with his black ships and foreign demands, shattered the myth of Japanese self-containment. The opening of Yokohama port in 1859 brought foreign merchants with different tastes, currencies, and questions the paperwork system couldn't answer. The Tokugawa shogunate scrambled to adapt. The bureaucratic systems governing tea, like many others, had no capacity to shift gears. Their slowness, once a strength, now became their undoing. Export tea and the end of internal protocol. The first foreign buyers who arrived wanted volume, not formality. British and American traders placed bulk orders for green tea. They didn't care if it was Uji, Sayama, or Kagoshima. They wanted 10,000 pounds, not 10 baskets with poetry tags. The clerks of Edo's tea magistrate office had no answer to this. A hastily created bureau, the Yokohama Export Tea Board, attempted to translate existing codes into export terms. But the language, both literal and cultural, didn't align. For example, a shipment labeled "Blessed First Spring Buds of the Northern Slope," a ceremonial code used by a Kyoto temple, was rejected by a Dutch buyer who simply wanted dry green leaves with good foam. The label was charming, but meaningless abroad. The older inspection system began to collapse from neglect. The Mampukujai Temple, once a hub of certification, recorded a 60% decline in official tea audits by 1861. Monks stopped renewing seal blocks. Inspectors stopped traveling. Merchants lead, bureaucrats lag. By 1865, tea brokers and producers had established direct relationships with foreign exporters, bypassing many internal checkpoints. A merchant house in Shizuoka, once bogged down by 8 separate travel papers for each shipment to Edo, now sent bulk crates to Yokohama with just a handwritten inventory and a weight certification signed by a harbor agent. The volume of trade and the speed at which it occurred made the old system not only obsolete but unworkable. The state had lost control of the tea trade, and nobody wanted it back. The fall of the tea magistrate office. In 1867, the tea magistrate office in Edo officially ceased operations. Its last document, a farewell memo to subordinate inspectors, reads with a tone of exhausted resignation: "The leaves now flow beyond our boundaries. Their paths are no longer ours to direct. Let those who handle them do so with care, even if not with precision." This marked the end of over 2 centuries of bureaucratic tea oversight. No ceremony was held. No monk offered blessings. The office shutters closed with barely a whisper. A new brew, Meiji and modernization. With the fall of the Tokugawa shogunate in 1868 and the rise of the Meiji government, tea entered a new phase. Now a national export commodity, tea became a source of revenue for Japan's industrial ambitions. The government funded tea processing factories in Shizuoka and Uji, training programs in mechanical rolling and steaming, quality control boards for overseas sales. Ironically, tea now required standardization, but of a kind very different from Edo's ceremonial seals. Instead of poetic tags, teas were graded numerically: Type A, Type B, Export Grade 1. The charm was gone, but the system worked. In 1884, Japan exported over 15,000 metric tons of tea. Mostly to the U.S., the paper trails were shorter, the language simpler, the taxes easier to calculate. The tea was no less fragrant, but its meaning had shifted entirely. Cultural shifts, the ceremony remains. Though the bureaucracy vanished, tea culture did not. In fact, the fall of formal state oversight may have revitalized the spirit of tea. With no need to conform to tribute standards or pass bureaucratic tests, tea masters and artisans began experimenting again. New regional styles emerged. Non-temple tea houses flourished. The tea ceremony became a private art, once more less political, more personal. Poetry returned, not to stamps or scrolls but to practice. In Kyoto, a group of former tea inspectors rebranded themselves as tea historians, preserving ancient recipes and blending techniques. Their work laid the foundation for what would become modern Japanese tea connoisseurship, surviving fragments of a lost system. And yet, even in modern Japan, fragments remain. At temples in Uji, dusty ledgers still sit on shelves recording tea shipments from 1743 with ink that barely holds. In old storehouses in Shizuoka, crates once used for tribute tea are displayed as antiques. And in Kyoto's tea museums, you can still find a seal block carved with a monk's prayer, a scent ladder used to grade leaf freshness, a sample of summer tribute tea grade 2, faded but intact. No one uses these anymore, but they're kept carefully, because the memory of precision, even pointless precision, holds its own kind of beauty. The slowness that shaped a nation. What do we make of it all? That for over 2 centuries, a nation chose to wrap its most delicate agricultural product in paper, ritual, hierarchy, and meaning. That it built an entire infrastructure not just to move tea, but to measure its worth, to declare its symbolism, to control its flow. Was it inefficient? Certainly. Was it excessive? At times. But was it meaningless? Not at all. The system trained a society to treat a cup of tea not just as a beverage, but as an event, a moment, a convergence of care and attention. Even the bureaucracy, dry and repetitive, taught discipline. It forced patience, and in doing so, it created space for something quiet, maybe even sacred. One final sip. So next time you drink tea, when you steep the leaves and wait, remember. You are participating in something that once involved entire offices of monks, endless scrolls, forged stamps, and weary inspectors trying to define perfection with wax seals. Tea has always been more than taste. It has been time, trust, and tradition. A system now gone, a ceremony still living. And isn't that what history often is? A forgotten rulebook behind something we still do every day. Picture a wooden barrel, half buried in dirt, wrapped in rope and smelling sharply of salt and turnip. Inside, vegetables ferment slowly, carefully layered, pressed, and watched. Outside, a tired farmer scribbles a tally on a wax sheet of mulberry paper. One barrel made, one tax added. This isn't the bustling heart of Edo or the court of a daimyo. It's a quiet village in Dua province, sometime around the early 18th century. And what's inside that barrel tsukimono, or pickled vegetables, is about to be regulated more tightly than the harvest that produced it. Why? Because in famine years, a pickled radish could mean survival. And wherever survival goes, so too does the bureaucratic urge to quantify, control, and categorize. Welcome to the long-forgotten world of pickle regulation in Edo period Japan. Why pickles mattered. In an agrarian society reliant on seasonal rice crops, preserved food was essential. Pickled vegetables were a cornerstone of rural diets, supplying minerals, salt, and vital calories through long winters or poor growing seasons. The average village household maintained several pickle barrels, sometimes hidden beneath floorboards or tucked into earth pits. There were many varieties. Takwen, pickled daikon radish. Shiazu, salt pickled cucumbers or turnips. Nukazyuk, fermented in rice bran. Kasuzyuk, fermented in sake leaves. Each required time, materials, and a delicate microbial balance. They weren't simply food, they were assets. And in a time of frequent crop failures, they were life insurance. So when famine struck, whether from flood, cold, or locust, the government took notice. Famine years and food oversight. During the Kyoho famine 1730–1733, triggered by poor rice harvests and widespread locust infestations, hundreds of thousands died across western Japan. But in the northeast, some villages weathered the crisis better than others. Why? Pickle storage. Reports from Mutsu and Dua provinces indicate that areas with well-maintained, community-monitored fermentation systems suffered significantly lower mortality. In response, Tokugawa Yoshimune, the then shogun, introduced what would later be called the barrel directives. These laws instructed local village heads, nanashi, to create inventories of all pickling barrels in use, record contents by type and quantity, register barrel makers and regulate their output, prevent the hoarding or private sale of pickled goods during declared scarcity periods. Suddenly, something as humble as a turnip in brine became subject to documentation. Barrels and bureaucracy. The pickle barrel became a unit of measurement. Each barrel was expected to conform to standard size specifications, roughly 36 liters, the same capacity as a typical rice barrel. Barrels had to be constructed from approved woods, typically cedar or cypress, and marked with a maker's seal, similar to rice sacks or sake casks. Every registered household was required to report number of barrels, location of storage, preservation method used, expected fermentation duration. A village scribe would compile this data quarterly and submit it to the regional agricultural magistrate, Nagio Bugio. In times of crisis, magistrates could order redistribution of pickled stores to neighboring hamlets. Those who hid barrels or falsified quantities could be fined, or in severe cases, lose tax exemptions. Monks and microbes, temples take over. In many regions, Buddhist temples oversaw the fermentation process. Monks were trusted to ensure fairness, often hosting communal pickle workshops where surplus vegetables were pooled and preserved together. Temples also provided fermentation charters, declaring certain barrels as sacred offerings exempt from taxation or requisition. But as with the earlier tea system, abuse followed. By 1741, the Shingon sect in Echigo was accused of forging fermentation charters for wealthy farmers, labeling luxury plum pickles as ritual nourishment for ancestral spirits. The government responded by limiting the number of exempt pickle charters per temple per season. One official memo referred to the situation bluntly: "Too many spirits are dining while the living starve." Pickles as property. Fermented vegetables became a formal asset class. Barrels were used as loan collateral, marriage dowry items, community trust holdings, in which multiple households contributed and shared. Some villages developed a stamp system, tagging each barrel with a braided cord and paper seal indicating ownership and date of production. These seals were checked periodically by village officials. A family in Iwashiro province once held 87 such seals, distributed across 4 homes. Their pickle stores, estimated at 2,400 kilograms, were equivalent in value to 2 years of rice tax. But ownership also brought danger. In times of hunger, barrels were raided. One farmer's journal from 1734 reads, "The pickles were taken in the night. We heard no sound. Only the smell lingered." The salt problem. Salt was the limiting reagent in pickle production. Without it, fermentation stalled or spoiled. But salt was heavily taxed and regulated, controlled by the shioza or salt guilds. During famine years, the guilds faced pressure to release salt stores at lower prices but often resisted, citing their own losses. This led to a black market in salt, especially in inland areas. Barrels of salted pickles became targets of inspection raids, with magistrates cracking open brine tops to check salinity and volume. Undersalted barrels were deemed unsanitary and discarded regardless of the owner's intent or condition. This practice sparked outrage. In one recorded protest in Iida village, 1751, women gathered outside the magistrate's house and poured spoiled pickles into his water basin, a symbolic act of rejection. Pickle taxes and classification. As demand for preserved vegetables rose, so did their economic classification. In 1762, the shogunate issued a new tax code listing 3 grades of tsukimono. Common preservation, ippen tsukimono, low-salt daikon or cucumber, subject to basic tracking. Luxury pickle kakyu zuke, plum, eggplant, or gourd fermented in sake lees or vinegar, taxed at higher rate. Ceremonial pickle jishiki zuke, temple use exempt but monitored. Tax was collected not in pickles themselves, but in rice equivalent per expected value of the product. This led to creative evasion strategies. Farmers would reclassify pickles under false pretenses. A sour plum wrapped in rice husk was for funeral rites. A spicy cucumber was livestock additive. Inspectors tried to keep up, but the definitions blurred. Famine, fermentation, and quiet defiance. The quiet rebellion against pickle regulation took many forms: barrel sharing between families to obscure ownership, unmarked fermentation pits hidden beneath sheds, trade in unsalted or partially dried vegetables, bypassing the fermentation threshold. One practice, known as twilight pickling, tassegerzuke, involved making tiny batches just before nightfall, letting them ferment briefly, then consuming immediately. This minimized traceability. Even monks adapted. A temple near Matsumoto maintained rotating memorial barrels, each blessed for a different ancestor, monthly technically exempt, effectively communal. Ending with a sour question. As the years passed and Japan entered the 19th century, new challenges would test the limits of this peculiar pickle policy. Western ideas of nutrition, science, and storage loomed on the horizon. So did more aggressive tax reforms and, eventually, the end of the shogunate itself. But before any of that, the barrels still stood. Lined in rows, sealed with rope marked with ink. Sour, salty, essential, forgotten but only just. So we must ask, what happens when a policy intended to preserve life begins to ferment into something else entirely? The pickle barrel may seem, at first glance, too humble a thing to carry the weight of policy. But by the middle of the 18th century in Edo, Japan, it was increasingly clear. These vessels were more than just containers. They were tools of governance, survival, and subtle resistance. In this section, we examine how a policy that began with good intentions ensuring food during famine gradually shifted into a broader mechanism of control. A system designed to feed people slowly transformed into one that classified, monitored, and judged them, all through the medium of fermented radishes. The shogunate's taste for control. After the harsh Kyoho famine, 1732-1733, Tokugawa Yoshimune's reforms introduced the first serious regulatory attention to pickling practices. Initially driven by public welfare, the barrel directives of the 1740s were intended to prevent hoarding and encourage food security. But the regulations grew. By the 1760s, the oversight extended to pickling durations, minimum number of days for each variety, storage temperatures, especially for luxury pickles, barrel rotation schedules to avoid mold accumulation, brine usage tracking, measuring salt-to-vegetable ratio. This was not because the government had become obsessed with pickles per se, but because it had become obsessed with order. And fermented foods, by their nature, were unpredictable. Fermentation depended on time, bacteria, and environmental conditions, things that couldn't be precisely standardized. And in a culture built on hierarchy and balance, unpredictability was unsettling. In the mind of the Tokugawa administration, if something could not be regulated clearly, it could not be trusted fully. Pickles as a mirror of social class. Pickles were no longer just food. They became indicators of class, status, and moral character. Peasant pickles, e.g., takwen and simple shiazu, were considered humble, nutritious, and practical. Merchant pickles, like kasuzuke made from sake leaves or umeboshi wrapped in gold leaf, were viewed with suspicion, seen as indulgent or even subversive. Temple pickles, often ritually produced, carried spiritual weight but were tightly monitored. When reporting barrel counts, villages were asked not only for quantity, but for type. High volumes of luxury pickles might draw attention. A peasant family with more than one kasuzuke barrel might be questioned. This created a culture of pickle conformity. Many villagers deliberately underreported their high-end pickles, or hid them in unmarked containers. Some pickled in gourds, pots, or buried urns to avoid barrel inspections. The pickle police, new roles for old officials. The spread of regulation gave rise to a new kind of minor bureaucrat, the pickle inspector, or zukebugyo. These officials, often drawn from lower samurai or retired temple stewards, were responsible for verifying barrel seals and registration slips, ensuring pickles matched declared types and weights, testing brine content with a tool called the shiosashi, a bamboo salt probe, inspecting for signs of hoarding or spoilage. They were widely resented. Villagers nicknamed them Nuka no Kami, lords of the bran, a sarcastic jab at their supposed self-importance. One diary entry from 1768 records: "He came again, the bran lord, sniffing the radishes and demanding more tags. I offered him a cucumber. He did not smile." These inspectors were poorly paid and often relied on donations from wealthier households. As such, corruption flourished. Corruption and collusion, a system in brine. It didn't take long for wealthy families and merchant guilds to begin manipulating the pickle system. Common schemes included duplicated seals, having 2 copies of a single registration slip to double count production; salt swaps, using cheaper, lower quality salt but bribing inspectors to approve it; ghost barrels, listing barrels that did not exist to inflate status or delay tax collection. Temples again played a role. In a case from 1772, the Rinzai monastery of Jamyoji was caught issuing blessing slips for ceremonial pickles that were then quietly sold to Edo merchants under tax-exempt labels. An internal investigation revealed that the temple's pickle blessing records were copied from a single previous year and reused 8 times. The penalty: a reduction in temple stipend and the public burning of the fraudulent barrel tags. Village resistance, subtle acts of defiance. Direct rebellion was rare, but passive resistance thrived. Some villagers diluted brine intentionally, knowing it would shorten shelf life but make barrels lighter, and therefore harder to inspect accurately. Others pickled small batches in cooking pots, rotating them daily and avoiding registration. A few families shared community barrels, rotating ownership weekly to avoid overcounting. Folk songs and children's rhymes began to reflect this quiet rebellion. One rural verse from the Tohoku region included the line, "Seal it with string, not with paper. Let the bran lord chase the vapor." Monks turned a blind eye. Some even blessed fake barrels as a joke, scrawling imaginary prayers on empty casks to fool inspectors. Famines return and the system cracks. The Tenmei famine, 1782-1788, brought the system to its breaking point. Facing widespread starvation, the government invoked emergency requisition laws to seize stored pickles from villages for redistribution. But several problems emerged. Fake declarations led to underestimations. Empty barrels were discovered in supposedly overstocked areas. Transport rot ruined large quantities during long-distance shipping. Anger erupted. In Shinano province, villagers protested the removal of ceremonial takwen pickles from temple stores. Though technically requisitioned for regional aid, many suspected the pickles were redirected to Edo elite households. Petitions circulated. One read, "These pickles are not ours to give. They were salted in the name of the ancestors, not the Lord." The protests were suppressed, but they marked a turning point. After Tenmei, enforcement grew less aggressive. Inspectors visited less frequently. Barrel counts were accepted on faith. The pickle system was still officially in place, but it had lost legitimacy. A cultural shift from regulation to reverence. As the 19th century approached, the role of pickles began to change. No longer just sustenance or tax record, pickles became symbols of resilience and heritage. In Ise and Nara, communities began holding pickle festivals, honoring preservation as a cultural tradition rather than a bureaucratic obligation. Songs, prayers, and family recipes replaced inspection scrolls and brine tests. Some temples even retired their fermentation charters, preserving them behind glass as relics of a more invasive time. Even samurai houses, once distant from such practices, began to celebrate homemade pickles in their kitchens, sometimes in private defiance of former class restrictions. Salted into memory. The pickle inspection logs faded from use by the early 1800s. In some areas, they were repurposed, turned into account books, fire kindling, or tea shop menus, but their ghost lingers. In the preserved archives of Niigata Prefecture, one surviving ledger lists Barrel 43, salted turnip blessed at dawn shared by 3 homes, rot detected, family ate anyway. It's a simple record, but it tells us so much. People adapted, shared, hid, endured, sometimes lied, sometimes prayed, but always pickled. Because to preserve food is to believe in tomorrow. And so a briny question. When does preservation become punishment? When do policies meant to save lives become burden that shape them in unintended ways? And how do we know the difference between oversight and overreach, especially when all we're talking about is a barrel of turnips? You've seen how a humble pickle barrel could become a political object. You've watched the salt-stained hands of farmers mark ledgers, seen the quiet rebellion of nighttime fermenters, and heard the satirical songs of children mocking the brand lords. Now we reach the end of this curious chapter in Japan's history. This final section explores the legacy of pickle regulation, how it faded, how it quietly shaped modern food systems, and how, in its own small, briny way, it represents a perfect microcosm of Edo Japan's governing philosophy: discipline without direct force, conformity without open conflict. It's not a story of riots and revolution. It's a story of ordinary people preserving food, and with it, their dignity. The quiet disappearance of the pickle codes. By the early 1800s, as Japan's internal crises multiplied and pressure from the outside world mounted, the pickle inspection system began to unravel. There were no official edicts abolishing it, no grand announcement, just silence. In 1821, inspectors in Izu failed to submit their quarterly reports for the first time in over 40 years. By 1835, temples stopped issuing fermentation charters altogether. After the Tenpo famine, 1833–1837, many regional offices reclassified pickle inventories as secondary data, unnecessary, unless other food reserves had failed. The country's attention had shifted, from barrels to borders, from radishes to reform. Yet the system did not vanish, it lingered. Some village heads continued to maintain barrel ledgers out of habit, not law. Some temples kept offering prayers over pickle pits out of tradition, not obligation. The brine had seeped into the soil of culture, even if the paper seals had long since faded. Pickling in the Meiji period, from survival to industry. When the Meiji Restoration began in 1868, Japan moved rapidly toward modernization. Tax systems were reformed, Western agricultural methods introduced, and food regulation became centralized. Pickles, once a survival food and spiritual offering, became an industry. In 1872, the government issued a bulletin on safe fermentation techniques, advising the use of glass jars and promoting imported pickling salts. In 1880, the first commercial pickle factory opened in Tokyo, using steam sterilization and iron-bound casks. By 1900, tsukimono was a common export item sold in tightly packed wooden crates to buyers in China, Hawaii, and California. But even then, echoes of the old systems remained. Factories often mimicked the temple practice of labeling barrels with seasonal blessings. The phrase Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, prayer for abundance, appeared not just on shrines, but on shipping invoices. Cultural legacy, pickles as memory. In the countryside, fermentation remained personal. Rural families passed down nuka beds, rice bran fermentation pots, from generation to generation. Many were over 100 years old. These beds, alive with bacteria and tradition, required daily stirring and constant attention. They could not be mass-produced. The rituals lingered. A wooden ladle passed only to daughters-in-law. Morning prayers spoken while turning the daikon. The quiet, knowing nod when offering homemade pickles to a guest. One Meiji-era writer, Kunikita Dapo, reflected, "In the city, pickles are crisp. In the village, they are slow. One has salt, the other soul." That soul was built over centuries of control, evasion, famine, and faith. Modern remnants, the ghost in the cell. Even today, remnants of Edo period pickle policy remain buried in unlikely places. In Nagano, a museum displays a 1786 pickle barrel still containing traces of kasuzuke. The brine has solidified, but the smell remains pungent. In Miyagi, an archive holds over 400 pages of village fermentation logs, complete with marginal notes on brine failures and salt shortages. In Shiga Prefecture, a local festival includes the ceremonial first pickle stirring, where the community honors ancestors by stirring a communal nuka pot one that's never gone empty since 1763. These aren't acts of nostalgia, they're acts of quiet continuity. And perhaps that's the point. Why pickle policy mattered. You might be wondering, why did this matter? Why spend decades regulating barrels? The answer lies in Edo Japan's philosophy of rule. The Tokugawa shogunate did not control through brute force. It controlled through administrative saturation. Every road, profession, and barrel was documented. Every inch of soil, every ounce of salt became part of the national ledger. This system was slow, often inefficient, sometimes absurd, but it worked. It discouraged rebellion by exhausting the energy for it. It fostered obedience through habit, not fear. It made governance seem eternal even when the people quietly stopped following. The pickle system was never just about food. It was about maintaining order in a disorderly world through repetition, measurement, and ritual. It was about building a society where the smallest acts, a turnip in brine, a ladle in a pot, were part of a national rhythm. Fermentation as a metaphor. Fermentation is, at its core, transformation through stillness. Nothing moves quickly. No fire, no steel, just time, microbes, salt, and patience. What begins as raw becomes flavorful. What begins as decay becomes preservation. That's what this entire system was, a national fermentation. Rules that began with fear of famine. Bureaucracy that solidified like brine. Resistance that bubbled beneath the surface. And a culture that somehow emerged preserved. The policy didn't last, but its influence did, seeping into food, language, memory, and identity. Final reflections. So now the next time you bite into a crisp, salty takwin or a sour umeboshi, pause. Think of the monks who issued blessing tags, the farmers who stirred their bran beds at dawn, the inspectors measuring brine with bamboo rods, the villagers who shared secret barrels in the dark of winter, the unspoken prayers whispered into pickles because there was nothing else left to eat. These are not grand events, they're quiet ones. But history is not only made by emperors and armies. Sometimes it's made by radishes. The clack of wooden geta on a stone path, the dull scuff of straw waregi sliding through mud, the heavy creak of leather soles beneath lacquered armor. In the Japan of the 14th century, what a person wore on their feet wasn't merely a matter of function, it was a statement of status, legality, and economy. And for the rulers of the Ashikaga shogunate, 1336–1573, those humble sandals, particularly those made of leather, became taxable assets, recordable obligations, and even signs of loyalty or rebellion. Yes, this is a story about sandals, but it's also about the way bureaucracies latch on to the everyday how leather, once a marginal good scorned by spiritual law and ignored by the court, became essential to the infrastructure of both samurai armies and shogunal account books. And how, in that transformation, we can trace the strange walkways of history lined with shoes, scrolls, taxes, and silence. Leather and the lowly, a complicated start. In medieval Japan, leather had a tainted history. Due to Shinto and Buddhist purity beliefs, leatherwork especially derived from dead animals was considered spiritually impure. Those who handled it, such as tanners and cobblers, were often relegated to the Ada class, the outcast group later known as buracumen. These communities lived on the fringes of towns, near rivers or slaughterhouses, and were excluded from much of mainstream religious and civic life. And yet, ironically, society depended on them. Leather was used for armor bindings and belts, drumheads for court and temple use, horse tack and stirrups, sandals for warriors and messengers. By the mid-1300s, the Ashikaga shogunate, having risen to power through military force, recognized that its army couldn't march on sandals made from straw alone. They needed leather, durable, replaceable, taxable. The first leather levy. The earliest known record of a formal leather tax comes from a 1359 decree issued in Setsu province. It ordered local shoemakers to render unto the shogun's war office 1 pair of cowhide footgear per month, per household. The decree outlined acceptable materials: cowhide, horsehide, occasionally deer. Basic measurements: soles must be longer than 9 sun approx. 27 cm. Method of delivery: wrapped in oil paper and presented at the magistrate's gate. Failure to deliver incurred penalties, either a rice surcharge or the seizure of tanning equipment. From this point onward, sandal makers became official producers for the bakufu military government, and their work, once shunned, became essential to the machinery of state. The scrolls of the soles. As production scaled, so too did paperwork. Leather footwear became a documented item in village inventories. A tax ledger from Yamashiro province in 1378 includes the following entries: 2 sets of cavalry sandals, cowhide mid-grade, stamped. 1 set rejected for poor stitch quality. Supplemental pair offered in lieu of rice tax accepted. Each entry was marked with initials of both local inspectors and military quartermasters. Some entries even included diagrams, crude foot outlines drawn with brush and ink. These were not casual documents. They were binding legal records, verified at checkpoints and held for audits. And once again, temples got involved. Monks and military footwear. Just as Buddhist temples had been intermediaries in shell taxes and tea inspections, they now entered the realm of footwear accounting. Why? Because many temples owned large tracts of land, including areas where tanners lived and worked. These temples collected taxes in leather goods and, in turn, fulfilled quotas on behalf of their attached villages. Some temples, like Tafukujai in Kyoto, even developed internal divisions for sandal collection maintaining. Leather prayer sandals for ceremonial use. War sandals for shogunate delivery. Repair sandals made from patchwork scraps. Documents from Nanzenjai Monastery show receipts for 7 sandals, ash-bound, offered to the warrior monks of Mt. Hiya. The role of temples in this economy blurred the lines between impure labor and spiritual endorsement. It also allowed some communities to negotiate partial exemptions by donating sandals for temple rituals instead of government quotas. The sandal stamp system. As with other taxed goods, the question arose: how do you verify a sandal was made legally and delivered fairly? The answer: stamps. In 1394, the shogunate issued a decree requiring all taxable leather sandals to bear a burnt-in seal, a gettine that included a mark of the province of origin, the name or glyph of the producing household, the month and year of production. These seals were burned into the leather using a small iron brand, often heated over charcoal and pressed quickly to avoid ruining the material. Some artisans carved their own kakehan signature mark into the stamp. A single village might produce dozens of sandals per month, each with a unique identifier. Shogunate warehouses in Muramachi district reportedly processed thousands of these each year. In turn, sandal audits became a routine task, slow, methodical, and utterly mundane, but every stamp mattered. The Shoeless Rebellion of 1411. All systems provoke resistance. In 1411, a group of tanners and cobblers in Harima province staged what historians now call the Barefoot Revolt. Their demands: reduction of leather quotas during poor cattle seasons, fairer inspections, which they claimed unfairly rejected sandals for minor flaws, respect for the religious status of their temple-donated footwear. The revolt was not violent. It took the form of a mass refusal to deliver sandals and a coordinated campaign to flood the tax offices with identical, unsigned footwear, rendering the stamp system useless. Officials were overwhelmed. The shogunate responded with a mix of threats and temporary appeasement, allowing exemptions during poor harvest years. The revolt was quietly suppressed, but not forgotten. From this point on, quotas became seasonally adjustable, and stamp inspection thresholds were slightly relaxed. It was a small victory, but it demonstrated that even the most marginalized groups through their essential labor could disrupt the system. The sandals of rank and file. Not all sandals were equal. Documents from the Ashikaga military records classify footwear by rank. High officers, lacquered leather soles sometimes dyed red with silk straps. Samurai of middle rank, double-layered cowhide soles, iron toe guards. Ashigaru foot soldiers, single-layer rawhide sandals, no embellishments. Servants and runners, straw sandals with leather toe caps, cheaper hybrid form. These classifications were recorded in provisioning scrolls, and sometimes even cited during disputes. In a curious case from 1442, a samurai was fined for appearing before the governor in sandals above his station, having worn dyed leather soles typically reserved for higher officers. Shoes in this system were not just for walking. They were hierarchical markers like swords or family crests. Worn paths and fatting records. As the 15th century waned and civil unrest began to rise across Japan, the sandal system gradually lost its rigidity. The collapse of central Ashikaga control during the Anin War, 1467-1477, disrupted administrative structures. Tax records were lost. Stamp systems were ignored. Many provinces began producing leather goods informally or trading them directly in urban markets. Temples shifted their focus to land rights and defense. Monks stopped auditing sandals. Farmers stopped marking them. But even then, the habits remained. In some rural villages, records of leather quotas were copied well into the 1500s, long after enforcement had stopped. One such document, preserved in the Kyoto Prefectural Library, reads, "As was required by the shogunate in earlier days, the people of Kawabe submit their 4 sandals of leather, 2 with seal, 2 with prayers. May this be sufficient, though none may ask?" A soulful question. So we find ourselves once again in the dust and mud of history, looking not at grand palaces or legendary battles but at something walked upon, scuffed, sweated into, burned with stamps and burdened with quotas. These were sandals, but they were also statements, proof that even the most ordinary item can be transformed into an instrument of power or resistance. And we're left to wonder, What does it mean when society starts measuring people by what they wear beneath their feet? Imagine walking through the narrow streets of Miramachi, Kyoto on a foggy autumn morning. The mist hugs the tiled roofs, merchants arrange baskets of chestnuts, and monks sweep fallen leaves into tidy piles. Beneath it all, a quieter rhythm, the steady shuffling of leather soles against packed dirt. Everyone wears something on their feet: getas, zari, or heavy leather sandals, and though none speak of it aloud, those sandals carry meanings far beyond their function. In the world of the Ashikaga shogunate, footwear was fiscal policy, and every stamped sandal told a story of class, compliance, and subtle rebellion. This section continues our walk through the bureaucracy beneath the boots. Class in the codified soul. The deeper the Ashikaga administration embedded itself into provincial life, the more social roles became tied to material expectations. Footwear, once practical and symbolic, was turned into a codified indicator of one's place in the hierarchy. This was not simply informal social custom, it was written policy. A surviving manuscript from the Kyoto Prefectural Archive, c. 1430, outlines sandal prescriptions by rank. Class: footwear type, material, strap, stamp required. Shogunate officials: double-soled lacquered sandals, cowhide, lined silk, yes. Lesser samurai: rawhide soles, no lacquer, cowhide, cotton, yes. Foot soldiers: ashigaru, single-layer sandals, horsehide, hemp, yes. Temple retainers: cloth or straw, with leather tips, mixed hemp or none, optional. Artisans and tanners: crude stitched soles, mixed scraps, none required if tax-bound. Sandals were thus not merely garments, they were state-monitored declarations of identity. To wear the wrong type was not a fashion faux pas, it was a recordable offense. Taxation by the pair. With regulation came enumeration. Villages across Ashikaga-controlled provinces were required to produce, declare, and surrender sandals based on household size, occupational category, access to livestock for hides, proximity to tanneries. An official decree from 1422 outlines each dwelling maintaining 2 or more oxen or a full tanning pit shall surrender not fewer than 4 souls monthly, with stamping and scroll attached. Records were kept at regional sandal depots, typically located near marketplaces or temples. These centers collected goods, inspected stitching quality, and issued receipts, which were then verified by traveling tax auditors. Auditors operated on a rotational basis, sometimes visiting the same village only twice a year. In between visits, villagers were expected to maintain their own ledgers. Many complied, others adapted. Soft souls and the undocumented economy. As in other sectors of Edo period life, the appearance of compliance often sufficed. Unsanctioned sandals, unstamped, unofficial, unregistered, became a quiet undercurrent in the economic life of rural provinces. Villagers developed the practice of crafting soft soles, lightweight leather footwear that used less hide, fewer stitches, and intentionally blurred the line between shoe and strap. These were faster to produce, easier to conceal, sometimes worn inside homes, where inspection was unlikely. They were exchanged among villagers for rice, barley, and favors. Some were even used in barter with passing monks, who required durable shoes for travel but couldn't always pay full price. One village log from Mikawa province notes 7 soft soles made and not declared, used for burial ceremony, inspector not informed. Was it a true funeral? Perhaps. Or perhaps funerals, like so many things, had become useful legal fictions. When the sandal becomes a sentence, the stakes could be high. Inspectors had the power to fine, confiscate goods, or even requisition labor from families caught fabricating records or underreporting their quotas. In some cases, habitual offenders were sentenced to cord service, a kind of penal labor where the offender was forced to produce sandal straps under supervision. An entry from a Kyoto tribunal record in 1453 reads, "The house of Kenzo, having failed to produce its allotment for 3 consecutive moons, is ordered to surrender 2 members to the strap house for 7 days' labor." It wasn't prison, but it was punishment. These strap houses were rudimentary workshops attached to depots, where delinquent tanners, cobblers, or tax dodgers sat for hours in silence, twisting cord from hemp or cotton. It was menial, boring, and very public, stamping errors and sandal disputes. A surprisingly common issue in sandal taxation was the misplacement or misuse of branding irons. Because every tax-bound sandal needed an official stamp applied with a hot iron, or carved seal errors could lead to disputes. A sandal might be double-stamped, invalidating it. Some were branded on the wrong part of the sole, causing them to be rejected. A few bore stamps from neighboring provinces, leading to accusations of unauthorized trade. The result was a minor legal industry surrounding sandals. Villagers sometimes hired scribes to appeal rejections, claiming floods had washed away original brands, or that seals had faded due to excessive religious purification. There is even a surviving sandal petition scroll from 1461, in which 5 families argue that their sandals should be accepted despite appearing too symmetrical, which a suspicious inspector took as a sign of machine duplication, an impossibility at the time. The petition concludes, "We assert, upon the breath of Amida himself, that these soles were cut by human hand, if with some natural symmetry bestowed by heaven." Temples caught in the tangle. The temples, so often facilitators in systems like these, found themselves in a difficult position. On the one hand, they relied on leather goods for sandals, drums, and decorative armor used in processions. On the other, they were expected to enforce state quotas among their parishioners and tenants. To avoid conflict, many began issuing ritual footwear exemptions, documents stating that certain leather goods had been sanctified and were therefore unsuitable for mundane use or taxation. This led to abuses. Villagers marking normal sandals with ash or ink to simulate ritual usage. Temples overissuing exemption slips in exchange for rice. Inspectors retaliating by demanding blessing fees to accept exempted footwear. The result was a growing confusion over what sandals counted, what sandals didn't, and who had the final say. In 1475, one exasperated temple ledger includes the note, "2 sandals offered, 1 cursed, 1 blessed, both rejected." When feet went bare, the war years. As Japan entered the Sengoku period, late 15th–16th century, a time of near-constant military conflict, the shogunate's administrative systems began to fray. In war-torn provinces like Suruga, Mino, and Tamba, leather production became erratic. Oxen were stolen or slaughtered. Tanneries burned. Sandal quotas were suspended, then forgotten. Warrior bands and ronin often traveled barefoot or in makeshift cloth wrappings. Sandal regulation, once tight and meticulous, gave way to pure necessity. And with necessity came freedom. A scribbled note found inside a shrine wall in 1498 reads, "We now wear what we can, leather or straw, blessed or not, no one counts anymore." Worn down to the sole. As order collapsed, so too did the sandal tax. It wasn't abolished, it simply disintegrated. Paper trails stopped. Inspectors left their posts. Temples stopped recording exemptions. By 1500, very few provinces still maintained proper records. The once stamped sandals, tracked with precision, were now traded freely at roadside stalls. And yet the stamps did not disappear entirely. Some artisans continued using them out of pride, a mark of origin, a legacy of legality. Even when no inspector would check, a few still burned their seal into the heel. Perhaps it wasn't about tax anymore. Perhaps it had become something else, a quiet memory of a system once walked in, now worn through. A question in every step. So we arrive here, feet sore, soles thin, scrolls yellowed, sandals stamped or not, traded, gifted, hidden, or surrendered. All that remains is a question. If a society can be tracked by its footsteps, how it walks, where it walks, what it walks in, then what happens when the records of those steps fade? What stories lie hidden in the leather soles, no longer counted? And who remembers the people who stitched them, one by one, in silence? By now, we've followed the leather sandal from its humble beginnings in the homes of outcast tanners to the scroll-laden ledgers of samurai bureaucrats. We've seen it measured, taxed, stamped, blessed, rejected, repaired, and repurposed. But like many systems born of war, tied to power and reliant on obedience, the leather sandal tax of the Ashikaga shogunate did not end with a proclamation. It did not collapse in a riot. It simply became irrelevant. This final section traces that slow vanishing and examines what's left in its wake. The leather trail ends in ash. The Anin War, 1467–1477, was the last gasp for many of the shogunate's bureaucratic systems. The war reduced much of Kyoto to ash, broke the power of the central government, and left provincial lords to fend for themselves. Among the many things lost in the fires were the primary sandal, tax registers for Yamashiro and Omi, depots that stored inspection stamps and tax quotas, temples that had served as collection centers and distribution points. In the years that followed, no one moved to restore the system. The war had shifted priorities from regulation to survival. The Ashikaga shogunate limped on in name, but the fabric of their statecraft, stitched together like the soles of tax sandals, had come apart. Sandals in the age of fragmentation. With no centralized government to oversee production, sandal making returned to local control. Tanners in towns like Sakai, Kafu, and Yuta began forming informal guilds. These were not legal entities but social networks, rooted in mutual need and self-preservation. They created new marks, not state stamps, but family crests, artisan signatures, and moan symbols to signify trade quality. These sandals were traded to merchants on traveling circuits, to warrior bands offering protection, to temples not as tax, but as offerings of gratitude. The leather industry became decentralized, and with that, freed in a way it hadn't been in generations. But even as the practice revived, the records did not. Scrolls were no longer kept, ledgers were lost or repurposed, stamps melted down for tools. The tax sandal, once central to military provisioning, became just another item in the bustle of Sengoku life. Monastic memory and the last sandals. A few monasteries continued to remember. At Shinin Temple, a scroll dated 1508 lists 20 sandals blessed in the old fashion, though no longer delivered to a magistrate. A note in the margin reads, "No collector comes, but the people remember the rhythm." In Aihejai, a monk's diary records an unusual entry. A pilgrim arrived wearing soles stamped by the Muramachi office. He said they were his grandfather. We offered him tea. That pilgrim likely had no idea of the exact rules, laws, or weight requirements once associated with his footwear, but the symbol remained, a burnt circle, a mark of something now ghostly. Memory outlived enforcement. Meiji modernization and the erasure of class footwear. By the time the Meiji government rose in the 19th century, leather footwear had evolved. Western boots entered the market. Factory-made soles replaced handmade ones. But what truly disappeared was the association between leather and outcast status, at least officially. In 1871, the Meiji regime issued the edict abolishing discriminatory class status. which sought to integrate groups like the Ada and Hinnon into general citizenry. It did not erase prejudice, but it did end formal caste-based occupational control, and with it, any remaining connection between leather footwear and bureaucratic subservience. Yet the legacy persisted, in small ways. Elder tanners continued to mark soles with burnt patterns passed down for generations. Some rural families kept stamp irons in their attics, not knowing why. A few descendants of temple scribes claimed their ancestors once measured shoes for samurai. None of them called it taxation, but they remembered. Archaeological finds, proof in the soil. In the late 20th century, several archaeological digs in Kyoto and the Kinki region uncovered remnants of the old sandal system. Charred leather soles marked with official seals, preserved in the layers of burned soil from the Anin War. Scroll fragments bearing inspection notes. A rusted iron branding rod, its stamp still legible. A 5-petal flower with the character for West. Historians now believe this was the Nishiyama Depot's seal, one of several district-level inspection offices. These objects, once mundane, are now museum pieces, silent, worn, and unexpectedly eloquent. Language and the lingering trace. The tax system is gone, but it left linguistic fossils. The phrase "to wear someone else's sandals," Hito no geta o haku, means to take responsibility for someone else's duty, a likely echo of shared quota arrangements. The term sorzari, whisper sandals, refers to under-the-table dealings, possibly referencing the practice of swapping unstamped footwear. And hidarigeta, left sandal, is still used in some dialects to mean misfit or wrong rank, a nod to a time when symmetry was suspicious. Even in idioms, the system lives on. Bureaucracy beneath the foot. Looking back, the sandal tax seems absurd in its intricacy, but perhaps that's what makes it important. In the Ashikaga period, order was survival. In a nation scarred by civil wars, shifting allegiances, and famine, the ability to track even something as humble as sandals meant the difference between a functioning military and a scattered army. But beyond the logistics, this was a system that attempted to quantify the intangible. Status, labor, value, obedience. It failed eventually, not with flames or rebellion, but with fatigue. It faded as people simply stopped following. And maybe that, too, is a kind of victory. The final pair. In a museum in Nara, a glass case holds a pair of sandals made sometime around 1450. The soles are cowhide, worn thin. The straps are frayed but intact. The heel bears a faded circular burn mark, once a proud stamp, now barely a smudge. There's no plaque explaining the tax code, no scroll describing the quota, just a date, a location, a note, pair submitted by the House of Tsuda, Muromachi period. The sandals are silent, but they walk through history. A final reflection. We often tell history through kings and conquests, but just as often, history is carried on the souls of those who do the walking. Measured, rejected, hidden, blessed. A sandal, taxed and stamped, stitched by someone whose name was never recorded. And we ask, what else have we walked over and forgotten? Salt. In the grand theater of human history, few substances have held so many roles at once: currency, preservative, sacred offering, and instrument of control. For ancient Japan, particularly during the Nara period, 710–794, salt was all these things and more. It preserved food in the humid summers, purified spaces in Shinto rituals, sealed legal contracts, and even served as tribute to the emperor. But salt didn't move itself. Behind the elegant calligraphy of imperial decrees and the serene imagery of shrine rituals were men who counted, weighed, and walked through wind and rain, with their ink-stained hands and methodical minds. These were the salt inspectors. This is their story. The role of salt in early Japanese society. By the 8th century, salt production had become a pillar of state administration. The capital city of Hijokaio, modern-day Nara, was home to the imperial court, a sprawling bureaucracy, and a swelling population that relied heavily on salted goods. In the surrounding provinces Harima, Sanuki, Bizen, and along the coast of Seto inland sea salt was extracted via sun-drying seawater on sand beds, followed by collection of brine. Boiling brine in iron pans over fire, yielding high-purity crystals. Evaporation pits, carved from the shoreline, watched over by clans of producers. This white gold was not just harvested, it was accounted for. The imperial court required provinces to pay salt tribute, calculated down to the handful. It needed inspectors, trained scribes, and reliable ledgers. And so the Shiakukan Salt Office was born. The Shiakukan and its inspectors. Located within the northern administrative quarter of Hijokaio, the Shiakukan was a modest two-story hall built with cypress beams and clay walls. It housed salt inspectors Shiaku, scribes for documentation, weighing tools, bronze scales, wooden scoops, and calibrated baskets, scroll archives of salt records, quotas, exemptions, and disputes. The inspectors, typically recruited from low aristocracy or educated commoners, received years of training in reading and writing Kanban, classical Chinese used in official documents, basic arithmetic and proportioning, ritual purity practices, as salt touched religious domains, coastal geography and maritime tide patterns. They were not glamorous officials. They didn't make laws or lead armies. They recorded, inspected, and reconciled discrepancies. They lived among scrolls, and they were absolutely essential. Quotas, calendars, and counting by the moon. Each coastal province was assigned a monthly salt quota based on seasonal productivity. For instance, Harima, 500 baskets per month in summer, 300 in winter. Sanuki, 600 baskets per month in high tide months, 400 otherwise. Bizen, exempt from quotas during flood years, inspectors' discretion. Baskets show were standardized in theory, but in practice, slight regional differences required inspection of every shipment. Inspectors worked with lunisolar calendars, noting the tide cycles, full moons, and auspicious collection days to determine how much salt should have been realistically harvested in any given cycle. Their ledgers, bound in thin slats of bamboo or paper scrolls, often recorded far more than just quantities. Entries included salt load from Fukuda village delayed by storm, basket count reduced to 217, salt quality medium grade, crystals clumped due to moisture. 2 baskets from Ibara submitted late, no inspector present at time of arrival, accepted under temple seal but to be verified. Inspectors were expected to cross-reference physical shipments with previous records, shrine festival demands, temple exemptions, disease reports, which sometimes halted collection, ritual purity, and the inspector's burden. Salt wasn't just a commodity, it was sacred. In Shinto, salt was used for purifying shrine grounds, cleansing hands before rituals, scattering on thresholds to ward off spirits. Therefore, it had to be clean, untouched by death, and harvested in accordance with spiritual regulations. Salt inspectors had to observe ritual abstention before visiting salt beds or accepting shipments. This included abstaining from meat for 3 days, bathing in river water before inspections, chanting purification prayers at the gates of coastal saltworks. A note from a 758 inspector's diary reads, refused 18 baskets from Isanakami due to taint delivered by ox cart that had carried a funeral bier the day prior. This fusion of bureaucracy and belief made the job emotionally and physically demanding. The inspector was not just an accountant. He was a guardian of purity, a judge of ritual suitability, and a gatekeeper between the sacred and the imperial. Temples and the salt disputes. Temples received salt stipends from nearby provinces. Some, like Tadaijai, had the right to collect directly, bypassing the Shiyakukan altogether. This created friction. Inspectors frequently clashed with temple officials over salt basket counts. Temples often exaggerated quality standards. Temples accepted coarser grades. Missed quotas from surrounding villages. Temples blamed weather. Court blamed temples. In 768, a dispute between the Shiyakukan and Gangojai Temple reached the imperial council. Gangojai claimed that 40 baskets had evaporated in storage due to divine heat. Inspectors insisted the salt had been sold privately. The court ruled in favor of the inspectors, but the temple responded by refusing entry to the salt courier for 2 months, prompting a temporary salt shortage in the Nara kitchens. This was not just a squabble, it highlighted a truth. In Nara, Japan, even sacred institutions competed for salt. Salt in the shadows, smuggling and substitution. As with any valuable commodity under tight regulation, salt smuggling emerged. Coastal families began padding baskets with ash or dampened sand to meet quotas, trading unreported baskets to traveling monks or black market vendors, registering multiple harvests under one name to avoid taxes. Salt inspectors, spread thin across dozens of villages, often relied on local informants, typically minor officials or disgruntled salt workers. 1772 report notes. Suspicious movement observed near Kibai Harbor, 3 boats unloaded at night, no seals on baskets. Suggest inspection party be dispatched. But catching smugglers was difficult. Many villages claimed loss due to fog or blessing by the sea kami, invoking religious protections. And inspectors, though diligent, were not enforcers. Their tools were ink and math, not swords. A life in ledgers. Who were these inspectors really? A few names survive in marginalia. Ono no Moritsugu, who served for 19 years and never missed a basket count. Hamada no Kiyuki, who died during a coastal flood while inspecting a disputed delivery. Suda no Akemi, the first woman recorded, c. 784, to assist in salt inspection as a shrine scribe. Their lives were not celebrated in poetry or enshrined in temples, but their handwriting endures. Tucked in the archives of Shasen, the imperial treasure house, are scrolls that bear their brushstrokes neat, precise, repetitive, full of measured judgment. No flair, no grand drama, just numbers, moisture notations, and occasional lines like salt pure, grains large, scent of the sea no decay. A question crystallized. Salt crystals dissolve in water, and like those crystals, the role of the salt inspector eventually faded. When the capital moved from Nara to Kyoto, and imperial authority waned in the Heian period, so too did the centralized salt quotas. Local lords, temples, and private merchants took over. The Shiyakukan fell into disuse. But those ledgers, some survived, quiet testimonies of men and women who measured the flow of white gold. And so we ask, what stories hide in the records of those who counted, but were never counted themselves? The salt inspectors of Nara were creatures of habit, trained to see the world in measurements and margins. To them, a missed shipment was not just a logistical hiccup, it was a blemish on the smooth functioning of the state, a potential crack in the structure of ritual and governance. Yet, as Japan moved deeper into the late Nara period, even this steady rhythm was tested. Salt may have been sacred, but it did not exist in a vacuum. It was subject to natural disaster, disease, political change, and human greed. And through it all, the inspectors continued writing brush to parchment, line after line, often documenting not just salt, but a nation in subtle transformation. Floods and the fragility of the salt cycle. The inland sea, so essential to salt production, was not always kind. Records from 775 and 779 show major disruptions caused by seasonal flooding, particularly along the Harima and Bizen coasts. These regions, known for their wide salt flats and evaporation pits, were suddenly rendered useless, either submerged in brackish water or coated in river silt. A report filed by Inspector Kawabe, no Ito in 776 reads, "Baskets received, 0, salt beds unfit, pits flooded, clay turned unusable, local spirits blamed for the rising tide, offerings made, alternative salt requested from Sanuki." Rather than dismissing the spiritual interpretation, the inspector recorded it matter-of-factly because salt, like many resources in early Japan, was caught between nature and ritual belief. In some cases, emergency exemptions were issued. The Shiakukan granted temporary suspension of quotas if certain conditions were met. A local shrine reported environmental misfortune. Salt beds were physically inspected and deemed unrecoverable. Alternative sources were arranged to maintain imperial kitchen supply. This level of documentation suggests that inspectors held surprising authority, not only over physical product, but over interpretations of nature and divine will. Disease, death, and the silent ledgers. In 780, a measles epidemic swept through the capital and its surrounding provinces. Salt inspectors, often traveling through rural villages, were especially vulnerable. Several entries in the central ledger at Shiakukan from that year are marked not with delivery notations but with short, grim notes. Inspector absent, illness reported. No report from Izumo, presumed death. Scroll found unopened, inspector's house abandoned. For weeks the ledgers fell silent. And yet the system did not collapse. Junior scribes, shrine assistants, and even Buddhist monks filled in. Some entries are notably clumsier, fewer kanban phrases, simpler measurements, less commentary. But the effort to maintain continuity is evident. This phenomenon, decentralized endurance in crisis, marks one of the most fascinating aspects of the salt inspection system. It was not just a top-down operation. It was also a collaborative survival network. The inspector's ritual burden. By the late 8th century, the line between civil bureaucracy and religious ritual had blurred even further. Salt was now formally included in imperial funeral rites for preserving remains and warding spirits, land purification ceremonies conducted before constructing new court buildings, palace kitchen rituals where salt was scattered daily at doorways. Inspectors bore the weight of these rituals. A delay in salt delivery could delay a purification rite, which in turn could delay a construction project or worse, be blamed for misfortune. An entry from Inspector Shikata no Haruki in 781 reads, "Salt for the northern gate blessing arrived 1 day late. Court astrologer noted alignment disruption. Apologies issued. Blame assigned to coastal detour." This wasn't mere clerical fussiness. In the cosmology of the time, salt was a conduit of cosmic order. To disrupt its flow was to risk celestial imbalance. Inspectors became not just scribes, but ritual mediators. Scrolls and subtle rebellions. But not everyone bowed to the ledger. By the early 780s, coastal producers in Sanuki and Iyo began subtly resisting the system. Some refused to cooperate with the standard basket measures. Others began using different grades of salt, coarser, unboiled, or even mixed with other minerals to reduce labor. This led to a wave of scroll disputes, where inspectors and village heads exchanged long arguments written in formal script. One scroll from 783 documents such a case. Inspector, salt lacks crystal integrity. Improper boiling, basket weight under quota. Village head, our fires died due to wind. Sea Kami demanded half be left at shore. Inspectors visit on wrong moon day. The argument was never resolved, but neither side backed down. Instead, the inspector quietly lowered the village's quota by 10 baskets the following month, a tacit compromise, recorded but never acknowledged in court. These moments of bureaucratic give and take illustrate something vital. The system's endurance depended on flexibility, not rigidity. Salt and the social order. Salt inspectors sat in a strange space between elite and commoner. They were literate and trained, but their work was physical, humble, and often lonely. They weren't permitted in court ceremonies, yet their reports determined which ceremonies could proceed. They were respected, but not celebrated. Some lived modestly in Nara townhouses. Others traveled constantly, lodging in temples or by salt kilns. A rare personal diary from Inspector Tagami no Sho, dated 785, offers a glimpse. This village offered me sweet rice and fish. Salt was poor, but kindness great. I leave them with 2 less baskets than owed. May the kami forgive the indulgence. It's a small note, likely never meant for public eyes, but it reveals the quiet power of discretion that inspectors held and the humanity behind their ink. The sunset of central salt control. By 790, the imperial capital was preparing for relocation. Plans to move from Hijokayo to Nagyaka and eventually to Heiankayo, Kyoto, were underway. This disrupted much of the Nara administrative apparatus, including the Shiyakukan. Inspectors wrote less frequently. Coastal shipments became irregular. Temples hoarded salt for their own rituals, claiming protection under new spiritual authorities. A final joint entry in the Shiyakukan ledger from 794, written by 3 inspectors before they were reassigned, reads, "No further shipments expected. Baskets remain but no measurements made. Scrolls sealed. Let the next city count anew." That was the end. Quiet, bureaucratic, not a revolution, not a ceremony. Just a final line and a sealed scroll. A glimmer of continuity. And yet traces remained. Temples in Nara kept records of salt allocations well into the 9th century, often referencing old Shiyakukan procedures. Villages in Sanuki and Harima continued to prepare salt according to quotas, long after no one came to collect them. Monastic texts mention saltmen who arrived unannounced, measured with a scoop, and left behind prayers and warnings. Even in silence, the rhythm lingered. The ledgers were stored in a side hall of Tadaijai, next to unused ritual implements. Some were later used as calligraphy practice scrolls. A few were burned to light incense. But others survived rolled tight, ink faded but legible, held in storage rooms no one visited, waiting. The question crystallizes further. So much effort, so much ink, so many baskets counted, contested, and cleansed. For what? A system that disappeared not in disgrace, but in disuse. And we must ask, when we build our world on meticulous records, what remains when the record keepers stop writing? By now, we have walked the quiet corridors of the Shiyakukan, followed the tide-washed trails of the salt inspectors, and examined the sacred crystals that once helped define imperial power. Their world was built not of glory, but of gradual erosion and careful notation. This final section traces the twilight of the salt inspectors not with collapse, but with bureaucratic fatting, and reflects on what remains of their legacy in ritual, record, and rhythm. Post-Nara bureaucracy and the waning of ledgers. The capital's move from Hijokayo, Nara, to Heiankayo, Kyoto, in 794 marked a shift from an imperial bureaucracy of order to one increasingly ruled by courtly custom, noble influence, and aristocratic leisure. In Kyoto, The salt inspectors were not re-established with the same authority. The Shiakukan was not rebuilt. Instead, salt oversight was absorbed into broader commodity taxation under the new Ritsurio reforms, which focused more on rice, cloth, and land. The few inspectors who remained in office were given vague titles like Regional Commodity Scribe, Provincial Logistics Recorder, Salt Relay Overseer. None held the same ritual weight or direct influence as their Nara predecessors. A scroll dated 801, written by a scribe in Kyoto, refers to the salt inspectors as old men of ink and wind, measuring baskets that no one tallies. It was not mocking, it was mournful. They had become relics of a system no longer in use. Salt without inspection, the rise of private trade. As imperial structures weakened, regional temples and aristocratic estates, Shun, began to manage their own salt production. Without inspectors, private trade routes flourished, especially across the inland sea. This shift changed the nature of salt entirely. It became a market good, traded for coin or rice. The purity standards enforced by the inspectors were replaced by local merchant standards. Salt rituals began to reflect regional interpretations, not centralized mandates. The Toji Temple in Kyoto started producing salt for its own rituals and issued its own measurements, a basket equal to a morning's fire. Inspectors no longer visited. They were no longer needed. Instead of a scroll, a merchant ledger sufficed. The last known inspector. Among the fading echoes of salt bureaucracy, one name endures, Masuda no Takanari. His name appears in a rare document from 807, labeled Final Inspection Record of the White Crystal Storage at Tadaijai. Takanari, described as gray-haired and alone, apparently returned to Nara years after the capital moved, conducting one last independent survey of salt baskets stored at the temple. The document records no official orders, he had no authority, but includes notations in the same careful script as his predecessors. Salt dry sealed. 42 baskets remain, used in festival of purifying the Great Bell. Takanari's visit was likely symbolic, a gesture of completion, a quiet closing of a long, tedious, and sacred tradition. No record follows him. It is likely he was the last true salt inspector. Scrolls lost and found again. Many of the Shiakukan ledgers were lost to time, fire, or recycling. Some were reused as scrap paper during temple reconstructions. Others were repurposed into scroll wrappers or backing for Buddhist sutras. The sacred merged with the mundane. And yet a handful survived in full. Preserved in Shasun, the treasure house of Nara. Stored in Tadaijai scroll vault, overlooked for centuries. Rediscovered by Meiji period historians, puzzled by their dry contents. These scrolls are remarkable not for drama, but for repetition. Entry after entry. 28 baskets Harima village, fine salt, delay due to high tide. 32 baskets Ogi harbor, salt dry, crystals uneven. Inspection conducted on the day of the second moon. No irregularities. What makes them powerful is precisely their mundanity. They are a window into a system that believed in order measured, managed, and mapped by hand. Salt in ritual memory. Though the inspectors vanished, salt remained central to ritual life in Japan. In Shinto ceremonies, it still marks the boundaries of sacred space. It is sprinkled at sumo rings, mounded outside shop entrances for protection, scattered at funerals to purify returning mourners. The standards are no longer imperial, but the symbolism persists. Some rituals even retain echoes of the inspection era. In coastal shrines, salt offering baskets are presented in numbers that correlate with former quota amounts, often in multiples of 28 or 32, common shipment sizes in the 8th century. The past continues, not in law but in unconscious repetition. Echoes in language and profession. Even language carries remnants of the inspector's world. Shiomeguri, Chinese letter, Japanese letter. Salt rounds, now used in modern contexts to mean an unnecessary or bureaucratic journey. Shionomi, Chinese letter, Japanese letter, Chinese letter. Salt eye, slang in some dialects for a person with keen judgment. Shiofumi, Chinese letter, Japanese letter. Salt stepping, a practice in which people ritually step over salt to cleanse themselves, likely derived from inspection rituals. And in some coastal regions of Kagawa and Okayama, elderly salt producers still refer to their final drying phase as shikansen, or the inspector's gaze, though few could tell you where the phrase originated. Even in forgetfulness, memory lingers. The inspector's legacy, a different kind of heroism. History often celebrates conquest, invention, or rebellion, but the salt inspectors of Nara were none of these. They did not change the world. They recorded the world exactly as it was, day after day, for decades. Their heroism lies in monotony embraced, in care applied to repetition, in order upheld by invisible hands. Each basket counted, each delay logged, each variation noted not for fame but for continuity, for the emperor, for the gods, for the scroll. And when the time came, they faded not in resistance but in obedience. There is something profound in that. One final scroll. In a drawer at the Nara National Museum, one final scroll fragment survives, dated around 792. It's damaged, torn, the ink is smudged, but it contains a last, legible line written by an anonymous hand. The salt is clear, the moon full, we record because we must. No fanfare, no epilogue. Just clarity, moonlight, and duty. A final reflection. Bureaucracies rise and fall, but the need for careful record-keeping, for ritual observance, and for quiet trust in those who count the world never disappears. Salt slips through fingers, but scrolls endure. And so we ask, in our own time of endless data and fleeting rituals, who are our salt inspectors? When one thinks of Edo, the vibrant shogunal capital of Tokugawa, Japan, images of cherry blossoms, river barges, and samurai on horse might come to mind. But beneath those romantic ideals was a practical reality. Edo was a wooden city, flammable, crowded, and deeply dependent on regulations about light and fire. By day, the city bustled under the watchful eyes of samurai, officials, and merchants. But when the sun set, a different kind of order emerged, one based on lanterns, oil quotas, fire watchmen, and nightly inspections. And these things cost money. Welcome to the world of lantern levies, and night watch fees, the slow, deliberate system that kept Edo from burning and its citizens from stumbling in the dark. A city of wood, paper, and shadow. Edo, by the early 18th century, had become one of the largest cities in the world, with an estimated 1 million residents. Its buildings were made largely of wood and paper, built close together with narrow alleyways, heated by charcoal braziers, lit by oil lamps and candles. It was a fire hazard waiting to happen. And it did repeatedly. The Great Maraki Fire of 1657 destroyed 60–70% of the city. Fires in 1698, 1703, and 1728 displaced tens of thousands. Smaller blazes occurred nearly monthly in some districts. To prevent further destruction, the Tokugawa shogunate created a sophisticated nighttime oversight system. This system required money, manpower, and above all, compliance from commoners. The lantern levy system, Chachin Nengu. One of the most consistent and overlooked expenses for an Edo citizen was the Chachin Nengu, a yearly or seasonal tax collected to fund public lighting in the city. This levy funded oil for street lanterns, typically sesame or rapeseed oil. Replacement of paper lanterns blown away or soaked in rain. Laborers to light and extinguish the lamps each night. Lantern keepers who patrolled for missing or broken lights. Each neighborhood block cho was responsible for its own lighting. Within the cho, the Nanushi neighborhood headman collected dues from every household. The system worked on a simple formula. Each household, regardless of status, contributes X amount of copper coins mon per lantern per month. But the reality was less straightforward. Some larger homes required more lanterns. Shops with extended hours paid more. Tenants without front doors facing the street sometimes bargained for reductions. Scrolls from 1746 show common entries such as Ishikawa household, 2 lanterns 64 mon. Kikuya shop, late payment charge 3 extra mon. Empty house no charge, but lantern still maintained by neighbor. The levee system wasn't glamorous, but it was essential. Without it, the streets would go dark, and darkness in Edo meant danger, fire, and suspicion. The night watch fees, Yakebenryo. Closely tied to the lantern levy was another cost, Yakebenryo, or night watch fees. After the Great Meriki Fire, the shogunate mandated that each cho maintain its own night watch, a rotating group of able-bodied men, often drawn from among local townspeople, merchants, and occasionally hired hands. Their duties: walk the streets carrying wooden clappers, hayashigi, to signal patrols. Check lanterns and extinguish any unauthorized fires. Ensure fire buckets and ladders were in place at designated locations. Report suspicious behavior to magistrates. This system gave rise to semi-formal night watch teams, who began collecting small fees to cover. Uniform jackets, happy coats, clappers and bells, incense to mark time during long patrols, food and drink allowances for overnight duty. The fee was voluntary at first, then expected, then quietly enforced. Ledgers from the Bakuro-cho district in 1753 show neighborhood records like received 420 mon from total households, spent 387 mon, surplus used for new ladder. 2 residents refused payment, given written warning. 1 resident offered firewood instead, accepted by block leader. In essence, Edo's nighttime peace was crowdfunded, month by month, in copper coins and goodwill. The subtle hierarchy of light. Not all lanterns were created equal. The shogunate issued detailed regulations on who could use what kind of lantern, including commoners, small, square paper lanterns with limited visibility; merchants, larger lanterns permitted in front of shops but extinguished by midnight; samurai households, circular lanterns with the clan crest allowed all night; temples and shrines, stone lanterns or hanging oiled paper lamps maintained through religious donations. This created a visual hierarchy of light. The brighter your doorway, the higher your perceived status. Lantern shapes and styles acted as silent indicators of class and privilege. Poorer homes often shared lantern posts, contributing to a communal lamp rather than owning one. A commentary scroll from 1761 by a minor official observes, "In the alley of Eicho, one may walk and measure wealth not by coin but by lantern glow. The dimmest are the loudest sleepers." Even at night, social order was enforced not by soldiers, but by shades of oil light. Lantern licenses and inspector visits. To maintain control over this system, the Tokugawa government introduced lantern licenses in high-traffic districts, particularly those near theater zones, pleasure quarters, bridge crossings. These licenses allowed businesses to operate lanterns beyond curfew, sometimes as late as 2 a.m., but the privilege came at a price, often paid quarterly, and with strict inspections. Lantern inspectors, known as Chachin Aratame, visited shops to ensure lanterns matched the size listed on the license. Flames were enclosed and not exposed to wind. Oil quotas were not exceeded. Paper was treated with fire retardant paste, if required. Violators faced fines, temporary suspension of license. In severe cases, business closure for a season. A merchant diary from the Nihinbashi district in 1775 includes this note. Inspector came early, found excess oil in store lantern, paid 6 mon to avoid formal citation, will reduce flame tomorrow. This kind of petty negotiation was common. Inspectors were feared, but also negotiable, a delicate dance of compliance, bribery, and performance. Light as civic responsibility. Beyond tax and regulation, light in Edo became a symbol of civic participation. Neighborhoods that maintained good lighting were seen as prosperous, well-disciplined, safe and respectable. Poorly lit areas were associated with criminal activity, neglect, superstition, and ghost sightings. Some communities took it upon themselves to beautify their lanterns, painting them with poetic verses, family crests, protective symbols, such as the character for fire encircled. One 1780s festival in Ueno involved a lantern competition, where the most beautifully maintained public lantern received a gift of rice and sake from the local magistrate. These moments show that even in the tedium of monthly payments and oil rationing, pride and aesthetics endured. A closing glimmer. So we are left with this image. A narrow Edo street at night. Lanterns swaying in the breeze. The clack of wooden clappers echoing down the alley. A single patrolman checking the wick, muttering about late payments. A paper sign flutters. This lantern funded by the neighbors of Ebisucho. It may seem small, forgettable, but it was this system funded in coins, maintained by hand, and regulated with scrolls that kept Edo from descending into chaos each night. And so we ask, in a city of millions, what keeps the night from swallowing everything, and who pays for the flicker that holds the dark at bay? The flicker of lanterns in Edo wasn't just about vision, it was about vigilance. It was not just the cost of lighting that shaped the city's nocturnal landscape, but the structures that developed around it, the patrols, the fines, the rituals, and the fears that lingered in every smoky alley. In this section, we explore how fear of fire, crime, and disorder translated into practical, if tedious, systems of civic maintenance. Nightly patrols, bucket stations, and public shamming were the tools used not just to prevent disaster, but to instill a sense of orderly submission. And for most citizens, it was easier to pay than to protest. Fire, the constant threat in the capital of wood. Few threats loomed as heavily over Edo as fire. There's an old saying from the Edo period. Fires and quarrels are the flowers of Edo. It was a grim joke. The city suffered nearly 100 major fires between 1600 and 1868. Almost every citizen could expect to lose their home at least once in their lifetime. Fires spread rapidly through the tightly packed wooden dwellings. Firefighting water was often drawn from private wells. Watchmen were the only early warning system available. To reduce the damage of fire, every block was required to install and maintain a standard fire response kit. Fire buckets tioke, typically made of cedar or cypress. Ladders hashigo, to reach second floors or roof wells. Fire hooks hibashi, to pull down nearby houses and create fire breaks. Noise-making devices to raise the alarm, bells, drums, or even conch shells. These items weren't supplied by the government. They were funded through pooled night watch fees and maintained by rotating citizen labor. A common monthly note from a Cho head might read, 5 buckets cracked, 2 ladders termite-ridden, replaced from fund surplus, Street patrol advised of soft soil under hydrant. The nightly fire watch wasn't romantic, it was full of such mundane notes. But it was this very attention to the boring details that protected lives. Hierarchy and the chain of oversight. At the top of the night safety hierarchy were hierarchy mid-level officials serving under the city magistrate. They didn't walk the streets but oversaw the system, received complaints, and ensured that each cho was fulfilling its obligations. Each hierarchy had a territory covering several cho and was expected to conduct surprise inspections, review payment records and lantern logs, approve exemptions for elderly or impoverished households, coordinate punishment for delinquency or fraud. These bureaucrats were feared for their quiet visits. A hierarchy might arrive unannounced at dusk, accompanied by 2 or 3 samurai, and examine fire buckets for leaks or smell the oil in a lantern to test for dilution. If infractions were found, a written warning might be posted on the house gate. Fines could be issued, often in excess of monthly dues. Public shamming was possible through scroll notices nailed to gates, marked with the offender's name and failing. One such scroll from 1767 reads, "House of Masuda Genzo failed to light lantern on 3 nights. Fine imposed. Fire risk increased. Let this negligence be known." Again, there was no glory here, just recorded fear and civic shame. Private security and the rise of the Machabaikeshi. Though local citizens rotated duties, the threat of fire was so significant that by the mid-1700s, Edo developed a new class of professionals, the Machabaikeshi, or town firemen. These were not shogunate-appointed firefighters, those were the Bukebaikeshi samurai units. Instead, they were paid with pooled neighborhood funds, often recruited from former laborers or ruffians, divided into numbered brigades, e.g., Iroha 47 groups, known for their bravery and their theatrics. While technically separate from the night watch, the presence of Machabaikeshi in a neighborhood was seen as proof of safety and prestige. Their uniforms were flamboyant, their ladders were tall, their presence at festivals turned them into folk heroes. But they were also funded by boring means a separate fire response levy, sometimes bundled into the night watch fee. So even here, we find that community spectacle was underwritten by routine taxation. The economics of noncompliance. For all the system's order, there were always those who refused to pay. Some felt the fees were unfair, particularly tenants living in cramped backrooms who claimed not to benefit from street lighting. Others believed their own lamps and wells were sufficient, and some simply didn't have the money. The punishment for non-payment was not jail or fines initially, but exclusion from protection. Refusing to pay night watch dues could result in one's home being skipped during fire alerts. Households might be denied access to communal wells or ladders. Neighbors were instructed to let it burn if an unsupportive household caught fire. A story from the Kanda district in 1789 tells of a tailor who refused to pay the lantern levy for 3 years. When his shop caught fire one autumn night, the local fire team arrived but stood by, watching. He made his choice, one watchman reportedly said. The dues protect more than oil. Eventually, the fire was extinguished, but the tailor's shop was destroyed and his shame was absolute. The economics of fear had made their point. Lantern scribes and the rise of the administrative profession. All of this structure required record-keeping. Enter the lantern scribes, Chachin Hikishi, men employed by each cho to maintain monthly oil consumption logs, note lantern replacement and repair needs, track who paid and didn't pay, correspond with Yoriki and other officials. These scribes worked in relative obscurity, but were essential to Edo's nighttime order. Their scrolls were often read only by neighborhood heads, magistrates, and tax inspectors. A surviving ledger from Fukugawa in 1794 contains 97 pages of entries like Shimada household, 2 moon late excused for funeral. Lantern frame replaced, dried poorly in rain. Requested oil from surplus approved, must repay within 10 days. No drama, no emotion, just entries in black ink marked with red vermilion for priority cases. These documents offer a window into a city where order was written and rewritten, every night by hand. Women and the watch. Though the night patrol was male-dominated, women played subtle but vital roles. In many cho, women were the ones who trimmed wicks, filled oil, and repaired paper lanterns. Widows and unmarried women were often granted exemptions from dues, but in exchange, were expected to host watchmen for tea or keep a spare fire bucket by their door. Female monks in temple districts contributed oil for ritual lanterns and were counted in monastic lighting quotas. These quiet forms of participation reflected the reality that, while women may not have walked the patrol routes, they kept the lanterns lit and often, the records honest. A matron's journal from 1805 includes this note. The paper split. I mended it with rice glue. The watch passed without comment. I paid 2 mon for my daughter's sewing money. Even in the margins, the economics of domestic care played their role. A system of submission or stability. Looking back, the lantern levies and watch fees may seem like petty bureaucracy, and they were. They involved small coins, paper scrolls, quiet inspections, muted punishments, but they also created a structure in which millions could live in relative safety, even in a city built almost entirely of wood and fear. It was a system that relied on trust in neighbors, fear of fire, a shared understanding that rules, however dull, mattered. And in a city as fragile as Edo, that kind of boring stability was revolutionary in its own way. An unresolved light. So tonight, if you imagine Edo, imagine this. A glimmering row of lanterns, each one tied to a citizen's coins. A watchman claps his wooden sticks, disappearing into fog. A ledger sits open, ink still drying as someone marks a late payment. And in a corner, a woman folds fresh paper for the next lantern, muttering, "Let it last this time, just 1 more week." It all seems so fragile, yet somehow it held. So we must ask, in a world built on quiet systems, who guards the guardrails and what happens when the ink runs dry? In the shadowy corners of Edo's narrow alleys, a gentle orange light once glowed behind painted rice paper. It was not bright. It did not reach far, but it was enough for safety, for order, for peace. We've explored the structures that kept that light alive, the taxes, the ledgers, the fire buckets, the patrols. But now we move into the final chapter of this forgotten infrastructure. In this section, we watch the system fade, not with rebellion or flame, but with quiet obsolescence. This is not a story of collapse. It's a story of transformation, where oil lamps gave way to gaslights, ledgers to ledgers still, but written with different ink, under different empires. What happened to the lanterns? What happened to the people who kept them burning? Let's walk a little further into the night. The gaslight revolution. Brightness becomes policy. The Meiji Restoration of 1868 brought many changes: railroads, Western dress, military reform, and illumination. In 1872, Tokyo Gas was founded, modeled on British companies in London. By 1874, the first gas lamps flickered on in Ginza, illuminating a redesigned boulevard paved in brick. Suddenly, light was no longer something kept alive by neighborhood effort, paid for through shared coin jars, lit by hand and put out with a breath. Now light was infrastructure, centralized, predictable, and paid for by the state, not the street. The effect on the old lantern system was swift but fragmented. In wealthier wards, lanterns were removed within 5–10 years. In Outer Cho, residents resisted claiming gaslight was too harsh, too foreign, too expensive. Some blocks kept their paper lanterns as symbolic ornaments, lighting them only during festivals or power outages. A report from the Ministry of Public Works in 1881 notes, some alleys in Nihonbashi continue to fund oil lanterns via local dues. These are tolerated so long as no obstruction or complaint is issued. And just like that, the system became optional, then unusual, then forgotten. The decline of the night watch. As police departments emerged under the new government, the need for local night watchmen faded. In 1874, the Meiji government created a formal Koban system, small police boxes staffed by uniformed officers, armed, salaried, and trained. They replaced the neighborhood patrols, the haishigi clappers, the scribes with scrolls. To the relief of many and the discomfort of some, surveillance became nationalized, but it came at a price: the loss of communal enforcement. One woman in her 80s, interviewed in 1901, remarked, "The lantern men used to know my father's name. Now the policemen speak in clipped speech. They smile too much, or not at all." The city was brighter, but less familiar. The reuse and ritualization of lanterns. Not all lanterns vanished. Many found new life in religious, theatrical, or commemorative settings. Temples continued to light hanging lanterns at dusk now as a spiritual tradition, not public service. Theater districts revived decorative lanterns to maintain aesthetic appeal for tourists and patrons. Summer festivals featured mock patrols, with children banging wooden clappers and carrying replica oil buckets. A neighborhood in Asakusa began the tradition of the Lantern Parade in 1898, where residents carried family-style lanterns through the streets in memory of the nights when we paid for peace. The levies were gone, the dues forgotten, but the emotion lingered. What became of the records? Thousands of lantern and night watch ledgers once existed. By 1900, most were burned, discarded, or repurposed as scratch paper. But a few survived. The Edo Tokyo Museum holds 5 bound ledgers from 1780–1812, complete with oil quotas, payment rosters, and inspection notes. A private archive in Yokohama maintains a full registry of lantern dues from the Kajima-cho district, beautifully illustrated with lantern sketches. A monastery in Tamagawa contains fragments of night watch logs, used as lining for sutra cases, rediscovered only in 1975. These documents are dry, bureaucratic, repetitive, but between their pages are the small acts of a million ordinary people, chipping in so the night might be a little less dangerous. The metaphor of light. In literature, light is often used as a metaphor for knowledge, purity, or progress. But in Edo, light was a shared burden. It was something you contributed to, something you maintained, something you were held responsible for. It wasn't progress, it was obligation. You paid your due, you watched the wick, you shared the light. Even today, echoes of this mindset remain in Japan's communal culture. Shared apartment duties, neighborhood fire drills, Chanekai residential associations that maintain shared facilities. In a sense, the lantern levies never disappeared. They simply transformed into new civic forms, updated for the electric age. The final lantern, a thought experiment. Let's imagine a final lantern, somewhere in the outskirts of late 19th century Tokyo. The city is lit with gas and wire, but in one quiet alley, a paper lantern remains patched many times, its wooden frame warped from decades of rain. Each night a man walks down from his second floor, trims the wick, pours a little oil, and lights the flame. There is no more ledger, no dues to collect, no inspectors to check. And yet he does it. Out of habit, out of memory, out of respect. That lantern might not exist, but perhaps it did.